701 BC, 3194 AM. Before he dies, the prophet Isaiah prophesied that Judah will be carried away by the Babylonians because of the pride of King Hezekiah and his foolishness in showing the emissaries of Babylon the treasury of Jerusalem. Isaiah foretold of the rise of a shepherd out of Persia named him Cyrus, who would defeat Babylon and free the Judahites, even allowing them to rebuild their temple. This was a shock to the people, for the temple had not yet been destroyed. He predicted that Israel would receive a new covenant with God. The Saviour would visit men, and his visage would be marred and body damaged, that he would be a man acquainted with sorrows, grief, rejected by men, despised, and yet he would bear the people's grief and sorrow, that he would be wounded for mankind's transgression and be killed, his death justifying many before God because he would bear their iniquity. He would come to proclaim the, quote, acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance, unquote. This prophecy refers to the Messiah. The scriptures in both testaments repeat that mankind will know the time, but not the day nor the hour. But the year was never a secret. The year is 2106 AD, the 6,000th year of the Annus Mundi calendar. By this time, the Greeks of Cumae were firmly established in Italy. At this time lived Herophile at Cumae, known better as the Sibyl, in Campania, Italy. Though a Greek, Clement specifically referred to her as, quote, the prophetess of the Hebrews, unquote. The Etruscans in Italy venerated deeply the Sibyl, and so did the later Romans, as the office of Sibyl was later passed down through a succession of female prophetesses who wrote extensive prophetic texts. At this time, Syracuse began to be a thriving civilization, a people blood-related to Sparta. The Spartans were descended from the Lacedaemonians, who were Danans, and the Jews claimed kinship with them. Being a Greek culture using a Phoenician script, Syracuse was most likely founded as a new Syria. 1. Isaiah. 6. The Oxford Illustrated Companion to. 7. The Bible Fraud. 8. Wars that Changed the World. 697 BC, 3198 AM. The Anunnaki planet Nibiru is at aphelion, furthest distance from the Sun, after departing the inner solar system 366 years previously. It now begins its 366-year journey back toward the inner system. 687 BC, 3208 AM. The land of Phrygia, modern Turkey, is invaded by a mass of people, the Cimmerians, after a disaster. These were followed by others, Scythians. Chinese annals declare that on a clear night the fixed stars in heaven failed to appear, and toward the middle of the night there was meteoric rain. This was 140 years since the Joshua Comet Group passed over the ecliptic and departed the inner solar system, and in this year they return and a dust veil envelops the planet, blocking out the starlight. These Cimmerians were descendants of Israel, who were prophesied to populate Caria, Anatolia, and Lydia, where Phrygia was located. Quote, and I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, Pul and Lud, Anatolia and Lydia, that draw the bow to Tubal, Thrace and Macedonia, and Javan, Greece, to the isles of afar off, that had not heard of my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles, unquote. It was here that they would forget who they were, that they were the blood descendants of Israel. It was foretold by the prophets that in the course of their migrations the Israelites would forget who they were. Isaiah wrote, quote, for the Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes, unquote. And, quote, I will bring the blind by a way that they know not. I will lead them on paths they have not known. I will make darkness light before them, and crooked things straight. These things will I do unto them, and not forsake them, unquote. The author of Romans declares that, quote, it is written, God hath given them a spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, unto this day, unquote. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, unquote. Romans. Israel is prophetically referred to as Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribe of adoption, and the name of the firstborn, Manasseh, means forgetful. Isaiah the prophet called the people of Israel a blind people who have eyes. Israel has begun walking in darkness. Though they forgot who they were, they did not forget their faith. The early Phrygians at this time, and for many centuries later, believed in Attis, who was the Son of God, the only begotten Son and Saviour of mankind, who was crucified and resurrected to save mankind. Born on December 25th of a virgin, he was both the divine Son and the Father. His blood cleansed humanity, and he resurrected 3 days later as the Most High God. This belief was pre-Christian and prophetic, a faith maintained in later Galatia. As we will see in this chronology, everywhere the Israelites migrate to, this belief surfaces strongly among the people, that these Cimmerian invaders were Israelites and the predecessors of Christianity, New Covenant, is found by an isometric view of this date. 687 BC was exactly 720 years, golden proportion number, after Israel conquered Canaan and moved into the land of promise. In 687 BC, the prophecy that Israel will occupy Lud is fulfilled, and 720 years later was 34 AD, the foundation of the Christian faith, which was born in this year, the early Christian movement taking root quickly in Galatia. This year was 1260 years after Abraham was born in 1947 BC, and 552 years after the start of the Trojan War in 1239 BC, when Phrygia was invaded and destroyed by quakes and flux tube blasts that vitrified the lands. This was the 120th year of the founding of Macedon by Israelites in migration. It was approximately about this time that Egypt began employing Ionians and Carians as mercenaries. In Asia Minor and Greece there was an Ionian Renaissance in full swing, as the Aegean nations emerged from a long slumbering dark age. The Ionians began mercantile alliances with Phoenicia and Egypt. The ties between the Egyptians and the Carians neighbouring Lydia and Phrygia are found in place names like Phoenix and Phoenicus. At this time the intelligentsia of the Greek world were Ionian. Also at approximately 687 BC, 690 to 670 BC, the constitution of Sparta was enacted, a governing program, militant and radically different than their neighbours. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 2. Cataclysm. 3. Isaiah. 4. The Christ Conspiracy. 6. Stolen Legacy. 7. Ages in Chaos, Volume 1. 8. History in Quotations. 680 BC, 32:15 AM. In the 112th year of the Ethiopic dynasty of Egypt, King Esarhaddon of Assyria took Thebes in Upper Egypt in his first Egyptian campaign. He begins to rebuild Babylon and is the son of Queen Zakutus. Esarhaddon rules over both Assyria and Babylon. 677 BC, 32:18 AM. The Assyrians completely destroy the Phoenician city of Sidon, but the sea-girt city of Tyre is untouched. This is 68 years or 24,480 days after the Assyrians deported the 10 tribes of Israel in 745 BC. The solar year changed in 713 BC, 36 years earlier, so adding 5.25 days to each year gives us exactly 189 days, which means that the 24,448th day from Israel's deportation could still well fit within the year 677 BC, when the Assyrians returned to the west. This invasion was 552 years after the fall of Troy in 1229 BC, and 770 years, 70 times 11, after the exodus of Israel from Egypt in 1447 BC. 673 BC, 32:22 AM. Tullius Hostilius becomes third king of Rome, his reign lasting 33 years until 641 BC. This is the 80th year of Rome. 671 BC, 32:24 AM. King Esarhaddon of Assyria invades Aram, Syria, annexing it, and then astonishes the world by crossing his army over the Sinai Desert to attack Lower Egypt by surprise, sacking the ancient city of Memphis, Heliopolis, On. 668 BC, 32:27 AM. Ashurbanipal ascends the throne of Assyria, the grandson of Sennacherib, a king remembered by the Greeks as Sardanapalus. He ascended at death of Esarhaddon by the guidance of Queen Zakutul. He was a scholar appointed as king, and he set out to collect all the ancient texts of the Near East and abroad, sending scholars to distant nations to obtain copies of the oldest writings. He collected about 26,000 texts. He is famous for this library of Nineveh, which was discovered in 1850 AD, cuneiform records that have aided modern scholars in understanding the ancient world. A stone tablet written by himself boasts that his sages taught him the tablets, quote, from before the flood, unquote. This year begins a 666-year countdown to the birth of Jesus, c. 2 BC. He was a son of Esarhaddon. 1. A short history of the world. 2. Elder gods in antiquity. 661 BC, 32:34 AM. King Ashurbanipal invades Egypt and sacks Thebes in Upper Egypt, ending the Ethiopic dynasty which began its first year 130 years earlier. This is the 300th year of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, begun in 961 BC, and the 90th year of the Babylonian Nabosannah calendar, that began in 751 BC. In this year, the Greek city of Byzantium was founded at the narrowest strait between Europe and Asia. This city would later be called Constantinople and be the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Roman Empire, a city overrun by the Turks in 1453 AD, now called Istanbul. This is 270 years, or 3240 months, being 1080 times 3, after Israel and Judah separated in civil war in 931 BC. This was 115 years after the Olympiad calendar began, or 1380 months. 138 times 10. 138 is a phoenix orbit, and 92 years after Rome was founded, or 1104 months, 552 plus 552. The prophet Nahum at this time prophesied that the Assyrian capital of Nineveh would be laid waste and hidden from mankind. This was difficult for anyone to believe, for Nineveh had walls 100 foot high, thought to be impregnable, high towers, and the city covered a vast area. But this is exactly what occurred over time after the Babylonians and Israelites, as will be shown, destroyed Nineveh. The ruins of the city were not reoccupied but were covered by the desert over the centuries, and not rediscovered until 1842 AD. 1. A short history of the world. 2. Nahum. 657 BC, 3238 AM. The ruling families of Corinth are expelled and emigrate to Macedonia, where many people from Asia Minor were settling. It was 150 years earlier that Macedon was settled by the descendants of Israelites. Further, Corinth was founded by Israelites, as demonstrated earlier, the Ionians and Danaan. The immigration to Macedon makes sense in this light. This was 1242 years after the Babel dispersion, or 414 times 3 years. This was 270 years after Egypt invaded Judah in 927 BC. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 655 BC, 3240 AM. After 330 years below the inner solar system, the ancient Earth-killer comet group ascends and crosses the ecliptic. If they were seen from Earth, it is not known. What is revealed by these astonishing calendrics is that something of epic importance occurred in this year for Israel or Israelite descendants. 3240 Annus Mundi, 1080 times 3, and 2760 years, 552 times 5, before Armageddon. This was 2448 of the Vedic calendar, 1224 plus 1224, and it was 1224 years after the Battle of Kurukshetra, when the East fought the West and won in 1879 BC. This was also 1584 years, 792 plus 792, after the flood, 2239 BC, and 792 years after the Exodus that occurred in 1447 BC, or 2448 AM. As this was 2760 before Armageddon, it was also 276, 138 plus 138 after Israel and Judah split in the civil war of 931 BC. This was 90 years, 1080 months after the 10 tribes of Israel were deported into Assyria. as this was also 756 years, 108 times 7, after the Israelites conquered the kingdoms of Sihon and Og of Bashan in 1411 BC, and exactly 600 years, great year, since the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae was founded in 1255 BC. The sum total of these calendrics indicates that a mighty Israelite movement ended in this year and began a nation. Perhaps further research will shed light on what great people were founded in 655 BC. 645 BC, 3250 AM. Ashurbanipal of Assyria invades Persia and destroys its capital city, Susa. The Assyrians used Israelite auxiliaries in their forces. This was 720 years after many Israelites fled on ships in 1345 BC. After 286 years beneath the inner solar system, the Sodom-Trojan apocalypse comet group passes through the inner system. 642 BC, 3253 AM. The Romans engaged and defeated the Sabines at Mantrap Wood, and just after the battle a rain of stones fell from heaven upon Mount Alba near Rome. Reports filtered in that the stones had fallen upon the countryside and men were dispatched to investigate the stones. Shortly afterward a plague broke out and even sickened King Tullius Hostilius. Then a bolt of lightning struck the palace and burnt it down, with the king inside dying. This is the third year of the Sodom-Trojan apocalypse comet group, a pattern repeated after that of the astronomical omens and comets that afflicted the world in 1229 BC during the fall of Troy, which was the third year of this same comet group. In 1229 BC, flux tube blasts, thunderbolts, from heaven melted many forts and stone surfaces, vitrifying them in Anatolia, and this lightning that struck the palace was also probably of a flux tube from space. 1 Livy. 641 BC, 3254 AM. Josiah ascends the throne of Judah, said in the scriptures to be the last good king. By this time all copies of the Torah, books of Moses, were lost, the temple having been sacked by the Egyptians. During his reign a copy of the Torah would be discovered. 640 BC, 3255 AM. Antius Marcius becomes the fourth king of Rome, the grandson of Numa Pompilius, reigning for 24 years until 616 BC. Thales of Miletus was born, a famous Ionian who predicted the darkening of the sun to occur in 583 BC, Phoenix Transit. He was a Phoenician by remote descent according to Herodotus, probably an Israelite, and considered one of the wise men of Greece. 630 BC, 3265 AM. After 15 years over the ecliptic, the Sodom-Trojan apocalypse comet group has strewn a massive field of detritus, its orbital velocity slowing by about 5 years with the loss of mass, reducing its subsolar orbit to 281 years instead of 286. King Ashurbanipal of Assyria dies in this year. 628 BC, 3267 AM. Jeremiah prophesied in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah of Judah. He foretold that Judah would fall by an ancient nation and that Judah would be totally destroyed. While Judah would be led away into captivity, Israel would be driven into all nations, and that their captivity would actually be for their good. 1 Jeremiah. 627 BC, 3268 AM. Nabopolassar becomes the first king of the emerging Chaldean dynasty of Babylon when he led a successful revolt against Assyria. This was 124 years, 1488 months, 744 plus 744 of the Nabonassar calendar in 751 BC. The very end of the Babylonian year was 1273 after Babel, paralleling the 1273 BC date Assyria annexed Babylon. This Babylonian dynasty would last exactly 90 years, 1080 months, until 537 BC, when the Babylonians would be defeated by Persia. 622 BC, 3273 AM. The prophet Ezekiel is born, paralleling the 622 Anno Mundi date of the birth of Enoch in 3273 BC. As did Enoch, so too did Ezekiel prophesy many last days events from visions and dreams. 621 BC, 3274 AM. The infamous Draco of Athens passes stringent legal reforms that oppress the people, from which is derived the term draconian. The Athenians are thoroughly Greek, but their predecessors were Ionians, Israelites, the earliest Athenians claiming they came from 12 tribes. This year was 744 years, golden proportion, after 1345 BC, when the Israelites fled their allotted territories by ship for the Aegean, and 324 years, 108 times 3, after King Jedediah, Solomon, sold 20 Israelite cities to Phoenicia in 945 BC, one sacred number. 619 BC, 3276 AM. During some reconstruction in Jerusalem, a forgotten copy of the books of Moses was discovered inside the walls of a building. The priests began reading the scriptures to the people in the temple, and King Josiah immediately instituted spiritual reforms and had the altars of Baal and high places, groves of Asherah, destroyed throughout Judah. This was the 18th year of King Josiah, and the people were astonished at the contents of the Word of God. Israel's history is interwoven with both the orbits of Phoenix and Nibiru. In this year it was 2484 years, 414 times 6, or 138 times 18, from start of the Vedic calendar, the Kali Yuga or Black Age. This was also 828 years, 414 times 2, or 138 times 6, after the exodus of Israel from Egypt in 1447 BC. Additionally, this was 792 years Nibiru orbit after the Israelites first took land in Canaan in the War of 1411 BC. This is exactly 10 years before the Egyptians killed King Josiah in 609 BC. 1. 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. 617 BC, 3278 AM. King Nabonassar of Babylon makes war against the other Euphratian kings, Akkad being the seat of his Chaldean dynasty. In the 10th month of the year, the Assyrian and Egyptian armies attacked Nabonassar but were driven off. Then Nabonassar attempted to conquer Assyria, but was repelled, as recorded in the Babylonian Chronicle. After this, he was stricken by a disease which affected his ability to speak and lasted 7 years, almost to his death. Nebuchadnezzar, too, would inherit this condition from his father. At this time, the mother of the last king of Babylon was 31 years old, a priestess in a temple in Babylon, having been born in the 20th year of Ashurbanipal of Assyria in 648 BC. This woman would go on to live 105 years, 1260 months, to 543 BC, the 11th regnal year of her son Nabonidus. This was 80 years to the fall of the dynasty to Persia in 537 BC. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 616 BC, 3279 AM. L. Tarquinius Priscus becomes 5th king of Rome, reigning for 38 years until 578 BC. He was the son of a man from the Greek city of Corinth, considered a foreigner to the Romans. His first military campaign was against neighbouring Latins, and he victoriously brought many spoils back to Rome. He also laid the foundation plans for the Circus Maximus, and conquered many Sabine cities, his conquests resulting in a large influx of Latin and Sabine blood into the city. Through conscripted labour he built the famous sewers of Rome. Over 650 years later, Pliny the Elder remarked that despite quakes, building collapses and immense pressure, the sewers of Rome were still remarkably intact in his day. 1 Livy. 3 Natural History, Mining and Minerals. 615 BC, 3280 AM. King Artaxerxes begins the Median War against Assyria. The Assyrians call on their vassals to the north for aid, Cimmerians called the Uman Manda in the Babylonian Chronicle. These were the Israelites who had been taken into captivity and settled between the Black and Caspian Seas and along the borders of Media and Persia, 130 years earlier in 745 BC. These Cimmerians from Qumri Omri of Israel, king of Samaria, turned against Assyria and attacked the great city of Nineveh, forming an alliance with Media where many of their Israelite kin had been deported. This was exactly 792 years after Israel conquered Canaan and began a nation in 1407 BC, which occurred in the 2488th year of the Annus Mundi calendar. This was the year 2488, 1244 plus 1244 of Vedic calendar, beginning in 3103 BC. Israel has become God's battle axe and weapon of war as prophesied. The Assyrians were powerless to do anything about this breakaway state to the north, the Cimmerians immediately setting up their own government in a city called Arya. named after the scriptural Ariel, city of David, Jerusalem. This is the origin of the term Aryan, this city being the epicenter of Israelite migration throughout the ancient world. This is exactly 552 years before Rome annexed Judea in 63 BC. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 2. Post-captivity names of Israel. 614 BC, 3281 AM. King Cyaxares of Media destroys the Assyrian city of Ashur and forms an alliance with Babylon. In Media, the Sacs, sons of Isaac, become the dominant group in the land and no doubt played a significant part of the attack on Assyria. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 612 BC, 3283 AM. The waters of the Tigris River flooded and damaged the walls of Nineveh, as prophesied by the prophet Nahum. The fall of the capital is fixed in the Babylonian Chronicles, BM 21901. Nineveh was destroyed by three armies, the Medo-Babylonian alliance and the Medo-Scythian-Cimmerian alliance. Nimrud is also destroyed. Babylon is later credited with the fall of Assyria because Babylon became the next in a succession of empires, but their allies in Media would turn enemies and orchestrate their fall in 537 BC. Historians ignore the role of the Cimmerians in the fall of Nineveh. The Babylonian Chronicle reads that they, quote, ruined the temples of the gods of Assyria, all of them, unquote. These gods were the Anunnaki, who were worshipped in deified forms. 1. Nahum. 2. Post-captivity names of Israel. 3. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 609 BC, 3286 AM. Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt passes through Palestine and is opposed by King Josiah of Judah in the valley of Megiddo, Armageddon. The Egyptians were on their way to conquer Mesopotamia, as they knew of the instability of the Assyrian government, having lost major cities. Josiah feared Nabopolassar of Babylon and Akkad, which was the reason why he thought to oppose the Egyptians, but he was killed by dart throwers in battle. Pharaoh then marched on to the Euphrates and encountered not a declining Assyrian empire, but an emerging Chaldean one. The Babylonians routed the Egyptians and chased them all the way back to Egypt. This reveals the power of the Chaldean dynasty, for they fought off the Egyptians when the Assyrians were still in possession of a mighty army that would last another 2 years. Pharaoh Necho II, sometime later, commissioned Phoenician sailors to sail around Africa, starting from the Arabian Sea. They sailed around the continent and entered the Mediterranean through the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, in 2 years' sailing, the duration caused because they had to stop and sow and reap a harvest. 1. 2 Chronicles. 2. A Short History of the World. 3. Ancient Mysteries. 608 BC, 3287 AM. King Nabopolassar of Babylonia destroys the Assyrian-occupied city of Haran, this being 54 years, half of 108, before the first regnal year of King Nabonidus in 554 BC, according to the Stele of Nabonidus. 607 BC, 3288 AM. The Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylonia engages the Assyrian army and utterly defeats them, ending the 666 years of Assyrian domination over the Near East since Assyria first became an empire and annexed Babylon in 1273 BC. This year saw the freedom of many Israelite-descended peoples that had been displaced and spread abroad by Assyria. This year was 2232 years, 744 times 3, since the founding of the Anunnaki dynasty before the flood, and 2208 years, 552 times 4 Anno Pyramid. It was also the 144th year of the Babylonian Nabonassar calendar, founded in 751 BC, and 138 years, 1656 months, Phoenix orbit, since the Assyrians deported the 10 tribes of Israel in 745 BC. Biblical scholars in the early 19th century had no archaeological evidence of the existence of Assyria. There was little by the way of proof to corroborate the biblical record. This changed in 1842 AD, when under the desert wastes the ruins of Nineveh were discovered, a city that the prophets predicted that God would hide from mankind. Amazingly, 1842 AD was precisely 2448 years after the fall of Assyria in this year, 607 BC. The ruins of Nineveh have since yielded forth tens of thousands of cuneiform writings and artifacts supporting the biblical record. The Egyptians again sought to contest Babylon for supremacy of the Near East. At the Battle of Carchemish, the Egyptians were sorely defeated again, this time by the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar II, a son of Nabopolassar, who was to die in 2 more years. This was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar II's rule, being crown prince, and the 4th year of King Jehoiakim of Judah, when God visited the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah proclaims that he had been warning Jerusalem these 23 years, 276 months, 138 plus 138, that they had angered God and that he would send Nebuchadnezzar II to carry the people away. He prophesied that Judah, Syria, Phoenicia, Ammon, and Moab would serve Babylon for 70 years, at the end of which time the king of Babylon would be punished. At the termination of the 70 years, many nations would arise against Babylon and Judah would return. Jeremiah declared that Ephraim, 10 tribes deported, was God's firstborn and that he would be scattered over all the coast of the earth and be inheritors of the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The prophet went on to say that God will enter a new covenant with Ephraim, not the Mosaic covenant, but one where he would, quote, write his law not on tablets of stone but in the hearts of humanity, unquote. This year begins the Second Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar II, though crown prince, counted the beginning of his reign at his second victory over the Egyptians. The last king of Assyria was chased away and vanished in history, King Ashurbanipal II. Judah falls under the rule of Babylon, and 4 Judahite youths are sent to Babylon, who are given Babylonian names: Daniel, Belshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Azariah, Abednego, and Mesnach, Judean name unknown. Daniel is a prophet and wise beyond his years. 1 Jeremiah, 5 Phoenicians, 2 Kings, 7 Daniel. 605 BC, 3290 AM. King Nabopolassar of Babylonia, who founded the Chaldean dynasty, died after a reign of 21 years in the start of his 22nd. The crown prince Nebuchadnezzar II, already king of Assyria, was now made king of Babylon. He had a feeble constitution and had the appearance of a dwarf, having inherited his father's condition, and this would become the basis for a famous biblical story in the book of Daniel. He was raised in a temple precinct dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, Ashtoreth, and this upbringing instilled in him a religious fervour that is evident from building inscriptions and texts from this period attributed to him. Like his ancient predecessor Nebuchadnezzar I over 5 centuries earlier, he too was a builder, king, and religious reformer. This was the 2nd year of King Nebuchadnezzar II, who counted his reign as having begun in 607 BC, when he defeated the Egyptians a second time. In this year, the king of Babylon has a dream of an image, a statue, with a head of gold, breasts and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, and legs of iron, with feet having toes mixed with iron and miry clay. The statue was struck by a stone from heaven, uncut by human hands, and the metals were all destroyed. The king of Babylon was disturbed and threatened with death all the sages and wizards of the realm, if they could not tell him exactly what he had dreamed and the interpretation of it. Daniel interpreted this message from God, which concerned 4 empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The stone would arrive in the last days to overthrow all human governments to establish the stone kingdom of the Messiah. In this year occurred a mass migration of Israelites from between the Black and Caspian seas. With the collapse of the Assyrian Empire and emergence of Arya, the Israelites began fulfilling the words of the prophets, beginning their migrations to the north and west. This is the text of 2 Esdras, dated to about 420 BC. And whereas thou sawest that he gathered another peaceable multitude unto him, those are the 10 tribes, which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea, the king whom Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, led away captive. And he carried them over the waters, Tigris, Euphrates, and so came they into another land. But they took counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go into a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they might keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half. 360 plus 180 is 540 days, half of 1080. And the same region is called Arsareth. Then dwelt they there till the latter time. The prefix Ar is a geographic designation for mountain, river, or any important geophysical marker. Between the rivers Danube and Don in Europe, both named after Dan and the Danube, is the river Sereth, as named on old maps. This is Ar-Sareth. Josephus in his Antiquities wrote that only 2 tribes migrated back to Palestine, and that the vast majority of Israel vanished into migrations. The Black Sea was long ago called the Cimmerian Sea, and these mysterious people erupted on the scene of antiquity, having no origin, no history, and were completely ignored by every ancient writer or annal prior to the 8th century BC. This is because prior to their appearance, the lands between the Black and Caspian Seas were home to small bands of marauding nomads before the Assyrians dumped over 50% of the Israelite population into the area. The Cimmerians were often written about by the Greeks and Romans, though they admitted their origin was unknown, though when they appeared they were already a vast multitude. Though Omri, was the origin of the name Cimmery, the Latin word Cimmerian means darkness, derived itself from the older Semitic Kemarim, darkness. The Cimmerians were those that the prophecies referred to. Quote, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, unquote. The prophecy refers to the Christianization of those Israelite peoples descended from the Cimmerians. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 3. Daniel. 4. Post-captivity names of Israel. 5. Antiquities. 604 BC, 3291 AM. Daniel and the other eunuchs from Judah taken before King Nebuchadnezzar II astonished him with their learning. He appointed them favourable positions in the Babylonian government. 1. Daniel. 603 BC, 3292 AM. In the 8th year of King Zedekiah of Judah, he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar II, and the Babylonian king swiftly besieged Jerusalem, lasting into Zedekiah's 9th regnal year. The king of Egypt came to Zedekiah's aid, and tried to raise the siege against Jerusalem, but they were chased off by the Babylonians, and the siege was renewed. Syria and Palestine fell to Babylon by formal agreement. This was exactly 324 years, 108 times 3, after the Egyptians sacked Jerusalem and took all the temple sacraments in 927 BC. The Babylonians take Jerusalem in this year. This is the first overturning of the throne of Judah, which was prophesied by Ezekiel to overturn 3 times. This was 7 years before the second overturning of the throne of Judah in 597 BC by Babylon. The third would be in 585 BC, with the final fall of Judah and the complete deportation of the nation into Babylon. After travelling for 540 days, a year and a half, the Cimmerians spread out and occupied the Balkans. As Cimmerians, this immense population is divided between about 6 different tribes, all of Israelite origin. Whole tribes crossed the Danube River into Europe. As this is 204 years, 2448 months after the founding of Macedon, there may have been some connection, war, or assimilation between them, especially in light of the evidence already presented showing that the Macedonian origin was in Palestine. This year begins the 1080 years of Daniel's prophecy interpretation concerning Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the 4 empires. The prophecy fulfillment began with Babylon, head of gold, taking Jerusalem in this year, 400 years after the establishment of the throne of David in 1003 BC. The sum of 1080 was the numeric seal of Israel, as was the Great Pyramid, a monument built and finished in 1080 AM, 2815 BC. This conquering of Jerusalem began 66 years, 792 months, to the final fall of Babylon in 537 BC. By Medo-Persia, breast of silver, who would rule over Judea for 207 years, 2484 months being 414 times 6. before they would be conquered by the Macedonians, thighs of brass. Macedon would reign until 146 BC, 184 years being 2208 months, or 552 times 4, when they would suffer defeat by Rome, legs of iron. In the year 63 BC, Rome would annex Syria and Judea, this being exactly 540 years after Jerusalem fell to Babylon, head of gold, and Israelites migrating as Cimmerians and Scythians, settling the Balkans in Europe, this people being the ancestors of the Germans. The year 63 BC is the epicenter between two 540-year periods, spanning backward and forward in time. For 540 years after 63 BC is precisely the year 476 AD, when the 10 kingdoms of Europe, led by the German Odovacar, conquered Rome. The year 1080 from the Israelite settlement of the Balkans and crossing of the Danube. The 10 toes mixed with iron and miry clay are the 10 kingdoms of Europe of Israelite descent, clay, mixed with iron, partially assimilating with Roman people over a period of centuries, these being the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Geneticist Brian Sykes had researched tens of thousands of genetic samples from around the world and concludes that the largest genetic contributors to the British Isles and Ireland came from the Middle East, as one group that migrated to the Balkans where they became two groups. One group followed the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, and the other crossed through Europe. They left their genetic markers in Spain, France, all of continental Europe, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and eventually America. This is exactly what will be shown as more and more proof of these amazing migrations are cited in this research on the origins of the Germans, Cimmerians, Scythians, Gauls, and Celts. 1. 2 Kings. 2. Secrets of Time. 3. Ezekiel. 4. Saxons, Vikings, and Celts. 600 BC, 3295 AM. This is the approximate date for when Solon of Athens visited Egypt and learned from the priests about the history of the world and the sciences. Solon was a moralist, a teacher, a lawgiver, and a philosopher who revised the laws of Athens to bring about more equity between the aristocracy and the common folk. The Egyptians told Solon that the civilization of Atlantis sunk 9,000 years prior, but this was exaggerated by a factor of 10. The actual disaster was trans-Mediterranean and occurred 900 years prior at about 1500 BC. 1447 BC exactly. 597 BC, 3298 AM. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon again invades Judah and sacks Jerusalem. In his 8th year of reign, biblical record counting from 605 BC, King Jehoiakim is executed and Nebuchadnezzar II appoints his son, Jeconiah, to take his father's throne. This is the second overturning of the throne of Judah as prophesied by Ezekiel. This was 2484 days, 414 times 6, after the 603 BC destruction of Jerusalem. The prophet Ezekiel is carried away into captivity in Babylon, where he continues his ministry. 3 months after appointing Jeconiah as king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar II imprisons him and takes him to Babylon, where he would remain for 37 years. Babylonians take the temple artifacts and the ancient tabernacle relics, the utensils and hardware. 1,000 golden cups, 29 silver censers, 1,000 silver cups, 30 golden vials, 24 10 silver vials, and 1,000 other vessels. This was 330 years, 3960 months, is 792 times 5, after the Egyptians sacked the temple in 927 BC. Nebuchadnezzar II lays siege to New Tyre off the coast. The biblical prophets declare that a king of Babylon will destroy Tyre for her pride, but this is not a reference to Nebuchadnezzar II, who after 13 years of siege in 584 BC gives up. The year Nebuchadnezzar II gave up the siege began a 252-year countdown to 332 BC, when Alexander of Macedon, now king of Babylon, besieged and destroyed Tyre. 1. 2 Kings. 2. Ezekiel. 4. Esdras. 596 BC, 3299 AM. Kingdom of Media gains supremacy over the Persians. The two nations have close relations. Among the Medes are the warlike Sacs. These people were known widely by their patronymic name of Isaac, quote, "In Isaac shall thy seed be called," unquote. The Sacs of Isaac Ishak were very populous throughout the former Assyrian territories, the main host having settled among the Medes. A large host of these people departed, migrating through the Caucasus and into Russia, where they became known as the Scythians, a Latin term for the Greek word skuthai, which was used to describe the Sac Geloth or, quote, prisoners of Sac, unquote. They are called Saki in the Persian Zendavesta, and they founded Sakland south of the Caucasus Mountains, and on the Jakartes River they built Samarkand or New Samaria, capital of Israel. Ptolemy related that a people from Media called the Saxones or Saki were later known as Scythians. Aeschylus wrote that the Sacae were noted for good laws and were considered a righteous people. Albinus Alcuin, notably the first Anglo-Saxon scholar, wrote that the European Saxons were descended from the Sacae of Asia. Pliny wrote that the Sacae were the most prominent people of Scythia, a people who settled in Armenia. Diodorus Siculus related that the Scythians were originally insignificant and few, but had grown into a formidable host and powerful. The learned Herodotus conferred with some Scythians and found them to be very intelligent and civilized. The Greek traveller was told by them that their race dated back 1,000 years prior to the invasion of Darius in 515 BC. Interestingly, 1,000 years earlier was 1515 BC, when the Israelites were multiplying in Egypt, becoming a mighty people. Herodotus referred to these people as royal Scythians, a people different from the other nomadic tribes, also in antiquity referred to as Scythians. He wrote that among the Scythians were the Getae, wanderers, a people believing in immortality, who went after death to Zalmoxis, which means God of Moses. The Getae lived in Moesia, or land of Moses. In this year a terrible plague afflicted Athens. Epimenides is credited with purging the city of the malady. 1. Genesis. 2. Tracing our ancestors. 595 BC, 3300 AM. In the 12th year, 144 months, of the captivity of Judah from 607 BC, the prophet Ezekiel foretold that Egypt would fall to Babylon, and that God would, quote, "cover the heavens and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light," unquote. This was a prophecy of planet Phoenix, which would darken the sun in 583 BC, 2 years after the reign of Judah. Ezekiel also foretold that the city of Tyre would fall, 2 years after the ruin of Judah. Ezekiel also foretold that the city of Tyre would fall, a feat believed impossible because it was an island protected by sheer cliff walls, virtually impregnable. He said that Tyre would fall to the king of Babylon, and because at that time Nebuchadnezzar too was besieging New Tyre, it was thought to refer to him, but instead the prophecy would meet fulfillment under Alexander of Macedon. Alexander would become king of Babylon and even dine and die in the famous palace of Nebuchadnezzar too. Ezekiel prophesied that in the resurrection the people of Judah and the Israelites would be reunited and become one people. 1. Ezekiel. 593 BC, 3302 AM. The reforms initiated by Draco, from which the term draconian derives, almost resulted in civil war in Athens. The statesman Solon arbitrates a settlement between the common people and aristocracy. He drafted and implemented legal reforms, planting the seeds that would later emerge as republics and democracies. This was 28 years after Draco instituted his stringent laws. This was 776 years after the Israelites took to ships and sailed to the Aegean and Peloponnesian ports in 1369 BC, 776 being a number repeatedly found in timelines involving Israel and Greek themes. 589 BC. Ancient Earth Killer Comet Group passes through the inner solar system. 585 BC, 3310 AM. The biblical record has Nebuchadnezzar II beginning his reign in about 604 or 603 BC, which was the year the Babylonian king took Jerusalem. In the 19th year he invaded Judah again and destroyed Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon. The prophet Jeremiah escapes after hiding the Ark of the Covenant. He and his scribe Baruch, with a Judahite princess named Tamar, and others flee by ship to Egypt with sacred records and a stone called Jacob's Pillow, that later kings of Scotland and England would be coronated on as descendants of the house of David. This is the third overturning of the throne of Judah as prophesied by Ezekiel. The authorities in Jerusalem had Jeremiah, the prophet, locked in a dungeon, but he was freed by order of King Nebuchadnezzar II himself. The prophet was initially committed to the care of eunuch Nebo-Sarsekim before being freed days later. Amazingly, this same Nebo-Sarsekim left behind a tablet record concerning a temple donation that was discovered in 2007 AD. Jeremiah hid the ark, the tabernacle and the altar of incense in a cave, according to the Maccabees text. But this is dubious, for we have records that the tabernacle and temple artifacts were carried away to Egypt in 927 BC and earlier by the Babylonians. Almost the entire nation of Judah was deported in chains with their belongings to Babylonia, where they were divided into two large groups. The first group were sent onward to settle in Media and the borders of Persia, and the second group was scattered in smaller groups throughout Mesopotamia. It is to be noted that in the biblical record there is no more mention of Israelites. The Judahites felt themselves a people apart from Israel. Assyria had fallen 22 years priorly, and now the populations of the Israelite-descended Cimmerians, Gimri, Kimbri, Galutha, Getae, Saka, and Kumri from Bith Omri were on the move, many already settling Armenia, the shores of the Black Sea and the Balkans. The fall of Judah was 1656 months, 414 times 4, or 552 times 3, after the siege of Samaria by the Assyrians in 723 BC. As Israel moved west in their freedom, Judah was marched east in bondage. Judah's destruction was total, entire cities being emptied and destitute peasants roamed the empty palaces. Unlike the Israelites, who were merely deported and resettled, the people of Judah were enslaved. In fact, slavery was a part of the foundation upon which Babylonian society rested. After the Babylonians departed, the Edomites quickly raided the waste of Judah and killed the locals who escaped the Babylonians. They had been trying to rebuild the temple when the Edomites came in and burned it down. For this the Edomites were cursed. The people of the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon rejoiced at the fate of the Judahites and were also cursed. The destruction of Jerusalem was attested in the Chronicles of the Chaldean kings. Jeremiah and his royal Judahite entourage sailed from Egypt and eventually landed in Ireland, which had been settled by Danaan and then later another branch of ancient Israelites called the Milesians. Through Phoenician shipping, contact was constant between Palestine and Ireland. The Judahite princess Tamar was well received at Tara and married to King Heraman, fulfilling a prophecy of Isaiah, quote, "And the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion," unquote. Through Tamar, the house of David continued. They lived at Ulster, and Irish traditions claim that Jeremiah with his scribe, Shimon Barak, were buried there. In the fourth year of the 48th Olympiad, 585 BC, during the reign of King Alyattes of Lydia, according to Pliny the Elder, a Phoenician by remote descent named Thales of Miletus predicted that the sun would darken in 2 years, 583 BC. This is the same thing predicted by Ezekiel the prophet, and as we will find, this was foretold because these men knew about planet Phoenix and its effect upon our world in a direct transit. This ancient astronomical knowledge of Phoenix was first evident when Atreus of the Argives predicted that the sun would darken in 1135 BC. Thales gained fame throughout the Greek world when his prediction came true. More on him in 583 BC. 1. Ezekiel, 2. Jeremiah, 3. Maccabees, 4. Sargon Magnificent, 5. 1. Esdras, 6. Antiquities, Josephus, 7. Isaiah, 8. The Stone Angle, 9. Natural History, Pliny, the Universe and the World. 584 BC, 3311 AM. Nebuchadnezzar II calls off the siege of Tyre during the reign of Ithabal, according to Menander in his Phoenician record, a chronicler from Ephesus. The fall of Tyre would not come until 252 years later in 332 BC by the Macedonians led by Alexander. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 583 BC, 3312 AM. After 5 years of warfare between the empires of Lydia and Media, they gathered on the field of battle when something very unusual occurred. Just as the armies were about to clash, the sun darkened, halting both sides from any aggression. This was not a normal eclipse, but the transit of planet Phoenix at the appointed time during its 138-year orbit. The calendarics for this year are astonishing. Phoenix darkened the sun right before the Great Flood in the year 1656, 2239 BC, and this is 1656 years after the flood. This appearance of Phoenix ends the Phoenix Age, the intruder planet falling out of sync with Earth as it passes through the inner solar system every 138 years in the month of May. The two armies concluded peace, and remarkably, both the armies of Media and Lydia would have had Israelites in their hosts. The empire of Lydia was made up of an influx of Gimri, the Scythian settlers migrating in waves from the northern Assyrian frontiers. The whole of Phrygia was overrun in 687 BC by Israelite descendants. The Lydians spoke Greek, but were relatively insignificant until their population swelled with the newcomers. In the biblical prophetic text of Isaiah 66:19, the prophet specifically mentions that the Israelites will occupy Lydia, Lud. A rock inscription in bas-relief at Yazilkaya in Asia Minor is believed to be a memorial of the truce between the Medes and Lydians. The king of Media, Cyaxares, with King Nabopolassar of Babylon, conquered Assyria. Later they were involved in a war against Lydia. Herodotus relates that a king of Cilicia on the Black Sea coast and a king of Babylon helped to negotiate the peace settlement. This king would have to be Nebuchadnezzar II. This is interesting, for this was Nebuchadnezzar II's 24th regnal year, and in the 24th year of his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar I, in 1135 BC, the sun darkened when planet Phoenix transited. Two things are noted by the scholar Velikovsky concerning this monument. The relief of Yazilkaya depicts the kings of Lydia and Media holding up an eclipsed sun, and also in the Annals of King Merciless we read, quote, "While I marched toward the land Uzi, the sun became obscured," unquote. This was 552 years after Atreus predicted the sun darkening in 1135 BC. 2 years prior to this, Thales of Miletus predicted that the sun would darken, and now in 583 BC his fame was known throughout the Greek world. Because Greek tradition holds that he accurately predicted the darkening of the sun, implies that the Greeks knew that it had darkened. Thales was honoured as the first of the Greek philosopher-scientists. He visited Memphis, Egypt, and he measured the height of the Great Pyramid by calculating the ratio between his shadow and the shadow of the monument. Thales believed that all things were full of God. It was his accurate prediction that brought instant recognition to Ionian knowledge, philosophy, and beliefs. With a rich heritage of ancient Israelite migrations through the cities of Asia Minor for over 7 centuries, it is not surprising that Herodotus mentions that Thales was a Phoenician by remote descent. Nor was it surprising that the Ionians, ancient Danaan, drew much of their knowledge from Egyptian sources. Unlike the superstitious myth-makers of antiquity, the Ionians were the first to provide natural explanations for seemingly mysterious phenomena. The affluent of Athens, Corinth, and Thebes, all anciently settled by migrating Israelites, sent their sons to Ionian schools. Thales' most celebrated student was the philosopher Anaximenes of Miletus, a city in Asia Minor that had exported wave after wave of Israelite fleets. Anaximenes also had 2 famous students, Anaxagoras of Clazomenae in Ionia and Diogenes Laertius. Many of the Ionian sages had similar names, like Anaximander of Miletus, who believed that the origin of all things was from an infinite God. Anaxarchus, also of Ionia, who accompanied Alexander of Macedon into Egypt in 331 BC. The popular Ionian root Anax, found in so many Ionian names, betrays their Israelite origin, a memory of the great Anak of Canaan. Robert Graves, in both of his monumental works, The White Goddess and the Greek Myths, demonstrates that Anak and Anax are the same historical person, a giant who lived in Palestine. Thales believed in the soul's immortality according to Diogenes Laertius, and he did not believe in Homeric cosmology or that of Hesiod. The Ionians did not hold stock in Greek mythology. This year begins the Japanese regnal lists. In the Chronicle of Japan, Nihon Shoki, the first emperor was connected to the sun. Why the Japanese kingship history begins at this date is not known. However, it is ironic that the Japanese emperor considered the sun as a symbol of kingship. It was 1104 years, 552 plus 552, earlier when Phoenix caused a global disaster in 1687 BC, and the dynasties around the world ceased calling themselves children of the sun. 1. Post-Captivity Names of Israel. 2. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 3. Stolen Legacy. 5. The Story of Philosophy. 6. City of God, Augustine, Book 8. 10. Cosmos of the Ancients. 11. Time Encyclopedia Britannica, 2008. 580 BC, 3315 AM. This is an approximate date for the event in the Chronicles of Eri, of ancient Ireland, of a ship landing in Ulster with a prophet and a princess, with a scribe named Breck. This was a tradition about Jeremiah, the princess Tamar, and Baruch. 1. Hitchhiker's Guide to Armageddon. 578 BC, 3317 AM. Servius Tullius becomes 6th king of Rome, reigning until 534 BC for 44 years. He would continue Rome's war against the Etruscans. During his reign, a census was taken, attendance compelled on penalty of death. The fighting men of war were numbered at 80,000. 1 Livy. 576 BC, 3319 AM. Daniel prophesied in this year in Babylon and composed the Book of Daniel, dated by the text of Josephus in Antiquities X11. Josephus wrote that the prophecy was made 408 years before it came to pass that the temple would be made desolate. This occurred, as we know, in 168 BC, when the temple was profaned by Antiochus Epiphanes with pig's blood, remaining desecrated for 3 years. The 408 years is a duration identifying Israel, for this is 4896 months, or 2448 plus 2448. The year 2448 AM, 1447 BC being the time of the exodus from Egypt and the receiving of the law by Moses at Sinai. 572 BC, 3323 AM. Nebuchadnezzar II destroys the city of Old Tyre on the mainland, unable to harm New Tyre on the fortified island. In this year, the city of Carthage on the North African coast gains its independence from Phoenicia, a city populated by the descendants of Tyre, Sidon, Syria, and Israel. This is 240 years before the destruction of New Tyre in 332 BC by Alexander of Macedon. 570 BC, 3325 AM. Approximate date for when Nebuchadnezzar II visited Egypt with his army and nobles in his 37th year of reign. This was a diplomatic ceremonial mission and show of force, related on an obscure fragment. This is also the approximate date of the 40th year of Anaximander, the Ionian philosopher who believed in the eternal nature of all things. He held that the earth was round and held aloft in space. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 2. Cosmos of the Ancients. 561 BC, 3334 AM. In the famous letter of Alexander to his mother Olympias that had been widely published, he mentioned that the Greeks counted the origin of the Persian kingdom to go back 233 years from the termination of his conquests. This would have been 233 years before 328 BC, or 561 BC. 1 Augustine, City of God, Book 12. 560 BC, 3335 AM. Nebuchadnezzar II suffered a serious psychological condition known as lycanthrope, a genetic condition he inherited from his father Nabonassar. As predicted by Daniel, the king loses his sanity and assumes the role of a beast and is confined in the court. The Chaldean nobility keeps the matter secret, and the condition lasts for 7 years. According to Berossus, Nebuchadnezzar II is succeeded by his son Evil Merodach. Evil Merodach elevated the status of former king Jehoiakim, giving him the rule over all the Judahites in the Babylonian Empire. This begins Jewish history and the form of government known as the Exilarchy, which had its own palace in Babylon and would remain the centre of the Jewish world until 1401 AD, this being 1960 years, 70 times 28. The fall of Nebuchadnezzar II was not a total end to the man, for after 7 years he was revived for a short spell to sanity and the throne before his death. Remarkably, this year saw the fall, but not the total end, of another famous king in antiquity. King Croesus of Lydia was famous throughout the ancient world for his material wealth and empire. He consulted the Delphic oracle concerning his plan to attack the Persians, and the Pythoness, oracular priestess, responded that Croesus would end a mighty empire which he interpreted as his victory over the Persians. He amassed his armies, among them many Israelites, descendants of, and invaded Persia, but was totally subdued by Cyrus, another famous king. Cyrus spared his life, continuing his royal privileges, but ending his empire. This was 28 years after Lydia and Media, the sister nation to Persia, made war against one another in 588 BC. 2 Kings. 559 BC, 3336 AM. Cyrus made war against Media after securing his empire in Lydia, marching against his grandfather Astyages, king of Media. Cyrus triumphed, crowning himself king of Media and Persia and fulfilling biblical prophecy. Now the Lydian west and the Medo-Persian east surrounded Babylonia, all controlled by Cyrus. This was 2664 years, 666 times 4, before Armageddon, and 2880 years, 144 times 20, after the Anunnaki descended to earth before the flood. Powerful figures in distant antiquity by this time, venerated throughout the Near East as gods. There were descendants of both Israel and Judah in the armies of Cyrus, spread throughout Persia, Media and the Lydian realms, including Asia Minor. This was 1080 years after Ephraim and Manasseh were adopted into the family of Israel in 1639 BC, and 888 years, golden proportion number, after Exodus. This was also the 600th year since the defeat of the Kassite dynasty of Babylon in 1159 BC, the Kassites having come from Elam or ancient Persia. 1. The 48 Laws of Power. 556 BC, 3339 AM. A solar eclipse occurred, viewed from Assyria, northern Mesopotamia, plunging the land into darkness as the moon passed over the sun, exactly 207 years, half 414, after the solar eclipse of 763 BC, recorded in the Assyrian eponyms. 1. End of days, Sitchin. 554 BC, 3341 AM. Nabonidus begins his reign over Babylonia, the son of Nebuchadnezzar II, 17 years before the fall of Babylon, according to the Nabonidus Chronicle. This is 72 years after the first regnal year of King Nabopolassar in 626 BC, and 54 years after the fall of Haran in 608 BC, according to the Stele of Nabonidus. Evil Merodach had reigned only 2 years and was assassinated by Nergal-Isar, his sister's husband, who then assumed the throne for 4 years. Nergal-Isar's son, a mere boy, succeeded him, but only reigned for 9 months. The youth's reign was marked with depravity and he was assassinated. The Babylonian court elected Nabonidus to be king, as Nebuchadnezzar II was still insane. On the orders of an oracle, the Spartans exhumed the body of a giant they believed was the person of Orestes. A skeleton measured at 10 feet tall, according to Herodotus and Pliny. This was 690 years, 138 times 5, after the 7 against Thebes, when Orestes was indeed alive. The ancient Thebans related by blood to the Lacedaemonians, called Spartans. This was also the 222nd year of the Olympiad system. 1. British Museum. 2. Natural History, Pliny, Zoology. 553 BC, 3342 AM. King Nebuchadnezzar's sanity is restored, and according to the Daniel record, he had an epiphany, acknowledging the power and majesty of the true God. His son Nabonidus seems to have been a silent king. During his final months alive, nothing was denied him by the court, and he retained the same kingly power he had before he had become insane. 1 Daniel. 552 BC. This is the approximate date for the birth of Pythagoras, the most famous ancient mathematician of all time. This Greek would travel to Judea, what was left of it, and learn among the priests of Egypt. He would even submit to circumcision to be admitted to the secrets of the Hebrews. He was the first to be called a philosopher. He was an astronomer and mystic who travelled widely to Phoenicia, Syria, Chaldea, Media, Persia, and even studied among the Brahmins of Hindustan. He would later in life settle in Italy and start a school in Crotona, most famous for Pythagorean theory. He believed Earth was a sphere. In this year, Heraclitus of Ephesus was 40 years old, an Ionian scholar, more scientist than philosopher. More on him in this study. 551 BC, 3344 AM. The famous Chinese philosopher Confucius is born. After 120 years of building, involving the combined efforts of 60 kings and labour from all the peoples of Asia Minor, the plan of the Greek architect Enthroned is completed at Ephesus, the famed Temple of Artemis, later to be renamed the Temple of Diana of the Ephesians. This magnificent temple would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This year was 4688 of the Anunnaki chronology, or 1344 plus 1344 years, and the Temple of Artemis was finished 112 years, or 1344 months, before the next great architectural work of the ancient Greeks was completed by the Western Greeks, the Parthenon in Athens in 439 BC. The Ephesian temple is the background of a very famous story concerning the Apostle Paul, 600 years after it was completed. This was the year 2552, 2000 plus 552 of the Vedic calendar. Amazingly, this is the 224th year since the first year of the Olympiad calendar, the first year being completed in 775 BC. These 224 years are 2688 months, 1344 plus 1344. The Eastern Greeks were more sophisticated than their Western counterparts, the Ionic states having more intercourse with the East than the Peloponnese and Northern Greek states. By this time, the entire Greek world is peopled by the descendants of Japhetic, Indo-European, and Israelite people. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Mining and Minerals. 547 BC, 3348 AM. The ancient temple of Delphi, seat of the oracle, was burnt down. The Greeks implored King Amasis of Egypt for aid, and he sent a fortune for the rebuilding of the oracle. This was exactly 900 years after the Israelites fled Egypt in 1447 BC, or 10,800 months. It was 864 years after the Israelites conquered northern Canaan, which became the territory of the Northern Kingdom after 931 BC civil war, which was exactly 414 years, cursed time, before the Delphic oracle burnt down. This was 504 years, 252 plus 252, after Israel elected a king, Saul, in 1051 BC, and 216 years, 108 plus 108, after the temple in Jerusalem was damaged in a quake in 763 BC, and 50 years, Hebrew Jubilee, after the Babylonians sacked the temple in Jerusalem in 597 BC. These calendrical connections reveal that the Delphic oracle and temple were ancient Israelite institutions. As we have seen, the early Danaan and Ionians were indeed Israelites. As we have discovered, c. 3031 BC, the sum of 864 is the foundation of geometrical time, linking both time and space. As this was 864 years after the Israelites in 1411 BC began receiving their inheritance in Canaan, the destruction of the Delphic temple was 2592 years, 864 times 3, to the entire destruction of the Western world in 2046 AD, and full-scale Anunnaki invasion, when kingship will lower from heaven, as depicted over and over in the Sumerian records. This was also 1008 years after Israelites aided in the defence of Egypt in 1555 BC. This was the 1260th year after the confirmation of the Abrahamic covenant in 1807 BC. 1. Stolen legacy. 546 BC, 3349 AM. Thales of Miletus, who accurately predicted the darkening of the sun, Phoenix transit, and gained widespread fame throughout Greekdom, died while attending the Olympics, aged 94. Anaximander of Miletus completed his work entitled Upon Nature. He believed that there existed a permanent and unchangeable substance beneath all matter, and that all forms and phenomena are merely transformation of this same substance. 1. The Naked Olympics. 2. God's Laughter. 543 BC, 3352 AM. The famous Buddha died, a Far East prophet and religious reformer. This is the first year of the Buddhist calendar, which began exactly 864 years, foundation of time number, after Israel became a nation in 1407 BC. It is an amazing parallel that the life and traditions about Buddha were the same as Attis of Phrygia, which concerned ancient Israelite faith. Buddha was believed to be a saviour, to have healed the sick, taught in parables, died a violent death when the sun darkened, and died for the sins of humanity. This Buddhist calendar began a 576 year, 144 times 4 countdown to 34 AD, the time of the very beginning of the Christian movement, the year or year after the crucifixion of Christ. In this year, the famous mother of King Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, died at age 105 or 1260 months. She was born in the 20th regnal year of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria and was a priestess of Babylon. She witnessed the rise of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II, she being 63 years old when Judah was destroyed and deported, lived on through the reigns of evil Merodach, Nergalissar, his wicked son, and her own son Nabonidus. Her life was recorded on a well-preserved votive stele. 1. Ages in Chaos, Volume 2. 540 BC, 3355 AM. The first year of reign of King Belshazzar of Babylon. The Judahite prophet Daniel dreamed of a lion, bear, four-headed leopard, and a dreadful beast, a mighty horn that overcomes them all until God sits in judgment, and a son of man who begins a mighty government over all nations. This dream concerned Babylon, the lion, and the future empires that would cause the Judahite disbursement throughout the world. Persia is the bear, Macedonia is the leopard, and Rome is the dreadful beast. Rome would finally disperse the Jews into the four winds in 70 AD, and again finally in 135 AD, when they destroyed Jerusalem and ruined the country. The amazing prophetic dream has a twofold interpretation. These four beasts dispersed the Jews in antiquity, but the lion, bear, leopard, and dreadful beast would return in the last days and bring the Jews back into Palestine, these being Great Britain in the Palestine Mandate, lion, Russia through pogroms that prompted Jews to flee into Palestine, the bear, Germany, which evicted Jews and prompted them to flee in World War II, leopard, and lastly the United States, which played vital roles in both world wars and will play a final role concerning Israel that has not yet met fulfillment. Also in this year, Milo of Chronicon in southern Italy, a Greek settlement, won the boys' competition wrestling at the Olympics. He would later go on to win 5 successive wrestling Olympiads in 20 years, a record no one has ever broken. As a youth on a farm, he carried a young bull on his shoulders all day as he went about his chores. He carried the bull as it grew to adult size. 1 Daniel, 2 The Naked Olympics. 537 BC, 3358 AM. Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, his throne name being Belshazzar, an antiquarian who restored the old temples of Babylon. He had old records excavated from below ruined foundations, discovering the foundation stone of King Naram-Sin, Nimrod, at Nippur. It is remarkable that the last king of Babylon found archaeological evidence of the first king of Babylon over 13 centuries later. In the 3rd year of his reign, the old prophet Daniel in Babylon dreamed a vision that he stood in Elam, Persia, where a two-horned ram, Medo-Persian Empire, pushed about until it encountered in a war a he-goat from the west, Grecia, with a notable horn between its eyes, Alexander of Macedon, that collided with the ram, throwing the two-horned ram to the ground. At the height of the he-goat's power, he became four notable horns, empire divided into four generals' territories. One horn became exceedingly powerful, wicked, and aggressive against the south, Egypt, and the pleasant land, Judea, this being Syria, under Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He would cause the sacrifice to cease and desolate the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. Most of this vision would come to pass in the following centuries, but Daniel was shown this vision because the beginning of the fulfillment would be in that same year, 537 BC. One night the king of Babylon holds a feast, orgy, in the royal court and orders that the holy vessels from the temple of Jerusalem be brought out. The court used these vessels for nobles, prostitutes, courtesans, and the king. They had been in the possession of Babylon for 60 years, since the sack of Jerusalem and the temple in 597 BC. A vision appeared and scared the wits out of the king, the image of fingers in the air that wrote a message on the stone wall that read, Mene mene tekel upharsin. Daniel the prophet was summoned to interpret the writing, which was layered with meaning. Daniel told them that it meant numbered, weighed, divided, explaining that the king had been weighed by God, his kingdom found wanting, and had been divided between the Medes and Persians. These words had a mathematical meaning as well, being in Aramaic measures 1,000 mene, 500 tekel, and 20 upharsin, adding up to 2520, 360 times 7. This year, the blasphemous employment of the temple vessels by Babylon, the same night the Persians took the city, counts 2520 years to 1984 AD, the exact midpoint of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran being ancient Persia and Iraq being Babylonia. Also in 1984 AD, the Temple Institute was founded for the preparation of the rebuilding of the temple and replication of the holy vessels. That night, according to Herodotus in his famous work The Histories, circa 450 BC, Cyrus of Persia had 360 channels cut into the banks of the Euphrates River to divert the flow of the water, so his army could enter the mighty city of Babylon under the wall, where the river ran into the city. The army entered the city with little resistance, the occupation of Babylon so swift there was not a battle. By this time there were many people in the Near East of Israelite pedigree. In fact, Jeremiah the prophet years earlier declared that Israelites would be among those that broke apart Babylon. Aristotle wrote that Babylon was so vast that even 3 days later, many districts of the city did not know that it had been occupied by the Persians. The holy relics and vessels of the temple in Jerusalem that had been destroyed fell into the hands of Cyrus. As Cyrus continued the military campaigns abroad, King Darius the Mede remained in Babylon and divided the great city into 120 districts, setting Daniel the prophet as chief over all the lords that presided over these districts. The first year of Darius over Babylon, he was not yet reigning in Persia. Daniel learns that this is the 70th year prophesied against Judah concerning the desolations determined for Jerusalem. Quote, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years, unquote. This 70 years began with Babylon invading Judah and Jerusalem in 607 BC. The Jews were permitted to return to Judah, but only about 40,000 ventured back to rebuild Jerusalem and the country. The actual number of years they were in captivity as a nation was 48, 576 months, from 585 to 537 BC. But this 48 years changed an entire people. During this 48 years, the race of Judah was transformed into the race of the Jews. H.G. Wells, in A Short History of the World, wrote that the people who came back to Jerusalem at the command of Cyrus were a very different people in spirit and knowledge from those who had gone into captivity. This change would be increased as the Jews then intermarried with the people of the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, whom they were expressly forbidden by the prophets to intermarry with. This amazing year was exactly 204 years, 2448 months, before the Persians would be decisively beaten by the next empire in prophetic succession, Macedon by Alexander in 333 BC. 1. Sargon the Magnificent. 2. Daniel. 4. Jeremiah. 5. 1 Esdras. 8. A Short History of the World. 536 BC, 33:59 AM. In the second year of Darius' rule over Babylonia, the prophet Zechariah receives confirmation through a vision that the 70 years revealed in Daniel's writings are accomplished. He prophesies of the coming of the Messiah, described as the branch and as having 7 eyes, the same description given to him in the Revelation record. 535 BC, 3360 AM. Daniel the prophet at 89 years old finishes the book of Daniel, a work of apocalyptic visions, similar to the Apocalypse revelation of the New Testament. Daniel is told twice that the interpretation is sealed until the end days. Daniel completes his book exactly 630 years before John received the revelation of the Apocalypse in 96 AD. 1 Daniel. 534 BC, 3361 AM. This is the 4th year of Darius over Babylon. As Cyrus had now returned from his military conquests, this is his 3rd year of co-rulership with Darius over Babylon. The biblical account claims that Daniel lived until this time when both Darius and Cyrus ruled Babylon. In this year Daniel had a vision when an angelic being appeared to him and spoke. Others nearby felt the ground tremble but did not hear what Daniel heard. The archangel Gabriel appeared and informed the prophet that 4 kings would rule Persia, the 4th king stirring up all nations against the realm of Grecia. But his kingdom would be broken, and afterward Egypt and Syria, Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties, would emerge from the 4 generals of Alexander of Macedon. These 4 would divide into 2 chief powers, dynasties, that would later make war against one another until a vile person, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, emerged and ruins Egypt with war, taking great spoil. The king of the north, Syria, would attempt to invade Egypt again, but he would be stopped by ships from Chittim, prompting him to return to Syria. Full of wrath, he would invade Judea and pollute the sanctuary temple, and take away the daily sacrifice. The Chittim are the Romans, and they would soon be entering the world stage as the next empire. In this year, Zechariah the prophet foretold that the Israelites would be remembered by God in the faraway countries he had driven them. He also foretold that the future Messiah would be sold for 30 pieces of silver. This was the price for a slave, the sum Judas accepted for betraying Jesus. Tarquin the Proud deposed King Servius of Rome with force, and then had him killed by hired assassins. Tarquin then had all the senators and his political opponents allied to Servius killed. Tarquin began the Temple of Jupiter in Rome on the Capitoline Hill, and the workmen excavating the site were astonished to find a human fossil head with facial features still intact. Etruscan diviners interpreted this to mean that Rome was to be the head of all nations. His name was L. Tarquinius Superbus, and he became the 7th king of Rome, his reign lasting 25 years until the rebellion resulted in the founding of the Republic of Rome in 509 BC. He was given the name the Proud because of a famous incident involving the Sibyl. The Roman prophetess was from a Greek settlement in Italy, and it was acknowledged that the Sibyls were originally Hebrew prophetesses. She appeared in the court of Tarquin with 9 holy books of prophecies, the Sibylline oracles, and demanded the king to pay her price for these sacred books that outlined the future. The king said no, and she cast 3 of the books into the fire, astonishing the court. Then they were further exasperated when she offered the 6 books remaining for the same price. Again the bewildered king refused, and she cast 3 more books into the flames. Then she demanded he pay the original sum for the last 3 books, and this time the stunned king relented and paid her price. These books were copied, and the books of the Sibyl became famous and consulted by the Romans. 1 Daniel, 2 Zechariah, 3 Livy, 5 Prophets of Doom. 530 BC, 3365 AM. Approximate time that Xenophanes was teaching. From Colophon he taught against the mythologies of Homer and Hesiod, abhorring the multiplicity of gods. He was about 40 years old. 1 Cosmos of the Ancients. 529 BC, 3366 AM. Cyrus of Persia passed over the Araxes River to conquer the populous Massagetae, a people dwelling in an expansive realm along the Caspian Sea. It was known that these were the descendants of the people the Assyrians forcibly deported from Israel 216 years earlier, 108 plus 108. Cyrus sought to bring them back under subjection. As Getae, they are identified as former prisoners, a people renowned for their warlike nature who were led then by Queen Tomyrus, who sent a message to Cyrus imploring him to leave, or, if he sought to attack, then wait for her troops to pull back so as to give his army safe passage over the river. It was a noble gesture, but Cyrus attempted to deceive the Massagetae and ended up killing many of them. They even caught Queen Tomyrus' son, who committed suicide. Queen Tomyrus sent Cyrus another message, asking him to leave and return her son, or she would give Cyrus more blood than he could drink. In the battle that followed, the Persians were decimated and Cyrus was killed. Queen Tomyrus decapitated Cyrus and immersed it in a vat of blood to fulfill her vow. The Getae would later be known as Goths, the greatest enemies of Rome. The Massagetae were the beginning of the fulfillment of Jacob, who adopted the sons of Joseph in Egypt, Ephraim and Manasseh, 10 years earlier in 1639 BC, a people who would grow into many mighty nations. This was 432 years after the temple was finished in Jerusalem in 961 BC. 1. The 48 Laws of Power. 2. Post-captivity names of Israel. 527 BC, 3368 AM. Another group of Jews departed the Persian domains to join their kin who were trying to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. This group came with great wealth given to them 2 years earlier by decree of Cyrus before he was killed. Archaeologists have also found a vase inscription concerning Cyrus giving the Jews a load of treasure for the restoration of their temple, an artifact excavated from a mound in Iraq. Josephus in Antiquities wrote that when the Persians permitted the Jews to return from their captivity to Judea, many did return. However, some from Judah preferred to stay in the Persian domains. He also wrote that the, quote, entire body of the people of Israel remained in that country, wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated in numbers, unquote. What Josephus did not know was that Israelites were all over Europe and Asia, having departed through the Caucasus passes and up through Asia north between the Caspian and Black Seas. As Israelite descended peoples filled the earth, the people of Judah were blinded as to the identity of their ancient kin, for none went by the name Israel after 881 BC. The calendrics for this year of temple rebuilding demonstrates its import. This was 1260 years after Jacob, Israel, was born in 1787 BC, and 476 years after the throne of David was established in Jerusalem in 1003 BC. This was a judged time period of 434 years after Israel and Judah engaged in civil war, and began the 2 kingdoms, the divided kingdom chronology in 931 BC. This was 400 years after the temple was sacked by the Egyptians in 927 BC. And 70 years after the Babylonians sacked the temple in 597 BC. 1. Esdras. 2. Zoroastrianism. 3. Antiquities. 525 BC, 3370 AM. King Cambyses of Persia, the son of Cyrus, conquers Egypt, defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III. Cambyses subjected Egypt right before he went insane and was killed in an accident, succeeded by Darius the Mede, who was ruling Babylon, son of Hystaspas. This begins the rapid decline of Egyptian culture. Persian influence permeated throughout Egypt and was quickly followed by Macedonian and Greek culture, before saturation by Rome. 1. A short history of the world. 521 BC, 3374 AM. With the death of Cambyses of Persia, Darius the Mede, Darius I, begins to reign over the whole combined Persian Empire. His reign lasts to 486 BC. In his reign, the famous Behistun rock was sculpted, an inscription that affirms that Scythia was the land of the Cimmerians, Samarians, Israelites. Darius reordered the building of the temple in Jerusalem after his own steward pored through the records of Cyrus and found a book with an edict of Cyrus ordering the same. Darius merely honoured the edict of Cyrus. This was 440 years after completion of the temple in 961 BC and 360 years after the completion of the Israelite capital city of Samaria in 881 BC. 1. Post-captivity names of Israel. 518 BC, 3377 AM. Approximate date for birth of Pindar near Thebes in Boeotia, the famous poet and composer of the Odes. In his Odes he briefly reflected on the Trojan War, writing also of the Great Flood in Olympian 9, lines 43 to 50. 515 BC, 3380 AM. Third decree of Persia for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. But this was a mere formality, for in this year the temple was completely finished, in this the 6th year of the reign of Darius I. 1 Ezra. 509 BC, 3386 AM. The son of King Tarquin the Proud, the 7th king of Rome, raped a virtuous woman named Lucretia. The woman opted not to live with a stain on her reputation and committed suicide. The nephew of King Tarquin consulted the Delphic oracle, a man named Lucius Junius Brutus, who assembled the people and deposed Tarquin, expelling him from the city. Interestingly, the families of the city of Rome began with the rape of the Sabine women, and the monarchy of Rome ended with the rape of Lucretia. In this year the Republic of Rome was born. This was 720 years after the fall of Troy. This event was later popularized as the expulsion of the kings. Brutus established annual political offices elected by the people, created legislation and instituted law courts. The total period of the 7 kings was 244 years, 3 of these rulers being Etruscans and 1 being the son of a man from Corinth, Greece. This was 720 years after the Trojan War, when the Danaan Israelites aided the early Greeks against the Trojan state of Ilium, and denotes that the year was important to the Greeks as well. This is exactly what we find. The Danaan were called Ionians on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, and in this year of 509 BC in the reforms of Cleisthenes, we have an official abolishing of the 4 Ionic tribes throughout Attica and Athens-controlled Greece. Amazingly, this new division was by territory to break the powers of the clans, and the reform created 10 tribes. The significance lies in that the Ionians, originally known as Danaan, were from the 10 tribes of Israel, who were by this time thoroughly Greek. 1. Cicero on government, the Brutus. 2. The Aryan race. 508 BC, 3387 AM. The world's first known democracy is established at Athens, or at least in the Western world. There was no doubt of other forms of democracy in small pockets of culture in Africa or in Polynesia. About this time flourished Hecatius of Miletus, an Ionian called the historian by Herodotus. He believed that much of the Greek myths were merely ridiculous stories. 1. Cosmos of the Ancients. 502 BC, 3393 AM. An approximate date for Ionian philosopher-scientist Heraclitus of Ephesus, who held that the works of Homer and Hesiod were cosmological garbage. He was totally against blood sacrifice and the worship of the gods, and abhorred idolatry. A monotheist, believing in one god who had many names. He believed that the number 108 was the greatest of all mystical numbers, and that the world suffered a burning conflagration every 10,800 years. 1. Cosmos of the Ancients. 2. Extraterrestrials in Biblical Prophecy. 498 BC, 3397 AM. An old Egypto-Coptic record that was copied from golden tablets was translated in this year for King Philippus by men claiming descent from an ancestral family of scribes from Egypt, who traced their lineage back to Ham and Noah, sages who could still decipher the pre-flood writings. The text from the golden tablets was said by these men to have been carefully copied from the surface texts found long ago on the Great Pyramid. The translation concerned the Great Pyramid before the flood and the records of scientific, historical and prophetic texts placed upon the monument's surfaces. The translators asserted that these golden plates were copies of these writings spanning a history 2372 years into the past, which, when calculated backward from 498 BC, is 2870 BC, the 55th year of the construction of the Giza pyramids. The writings had been copied off of the Great Pyramid in 2844 BC, or 44 years before the flood, 2239 BC. The golden tablet records preserved from before the deluge was a very common theme in antiquity, as seen over and over again in this chronology. Plato's account of Atlantis, a version of antediluvian civilization, maintained that their records were saved on golden tablets. Hopi legends concerning these golden records has them date back to creation, ancient records that detail the existence of a reptilian race of intelligent beings that also lived on Earth, whose original civilization was destroyed long ago. 1. Origin and significance of the Great Pyramid. 2. Secret places of the lion. 496 BC, 3399 AM. Rome is victorious over the Latins in the famous Battle of Lake Regillus. This was a time of rapid Roman expansion along the Tiber into Etruscan and Latin domains, people they openly assimilated into their growing population. 494 BC, 3401 AM. At the end of the Ionian Revolt, the Persians captured the city of Miletus, established by the Ionians about 8 or 9 centuries previously. The Persian Empire extended to rule over the Ionian Greeks on the east of the Aegean in Asia Minor. This was 120 years after the Persians conquered many Assyrian cities in 614 BC. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 492 BC, 3403 AM. Darius of Persia brought his massive army into Scythia, where the Israelites, Cimmerians of Samaria, had settled in 745 BC. Scythian emissaries came before Darius and gave him a bird, a mouse, a frog, and a bunch of arrows, which perplexed the Persian monarch. The interpretation of the items was given to him. Unless Darius' army took to the air like a bird, tunnelled into the ground like a mouse, or leapt into the water like a frog, they would never escape the arrows of the Scythians. Darius wisely fled from their land, leaving behind asses, the sick and wounded, and fleeing under cover of darkness back over the Danube River. This was 252 years after the year the Israelites were settled into the region by the Assyrians in 745 BC. The symbol of the bundle of arrows is of Israelite origin. The bow of strength was a symbol of Jacob later adopted by the Ephraimites, who were known archers. Thus, the arrows became an emblem for the Israelites, who were prophetically called Ephraim. The first instance of this symbol used in antiquity was by King Scyllaurus of Scythia. This symbol would survive with other Israelite symbols like the olive branch and Great Pyramid, and appear later as the Great Seal of the United States of America. The Persian army crossed the Hellespont River for the first time in history, the eastern nations sending an army over into the west to cross this barrier, this being 1407 years after the Babel dispersion of peoples in 1899 BC. The year 1407 BC being the year Israel crossed the Jordan to conquer Canaan. In the army of King Darius were many people descended from Israelite tribes and from Judah. 1. Post-captivity names of Israel. 491 BC, 3404 AM. The immense army of King Darius of Persia occupied northern Greece and threatened Thrace, Macedonia, as it drew nearer to Athens. This was 46 years, 552 months, after the Persians defeated Babylon in 537 BC and took over their empire. This invasion by the east into the west is 2592 years, 864 times 3 before Armageddon, when another war of epic proportions will be fought in 2106 AD. 490 BC, 3405 AM. Darius of Persia made his move against the centre of the Greek world, Athens. As his army marched along the coast, his fleet, a massive armada, kept up with them, a multitude of warships and cargo vessels from the eastern ports of Asia Minor and the Mediterranean. Up against incredible odds, the Athenians appealed to their enemies, the Spartans, by sending a runner to Sparta who ran the 153 miles in 36 hours, a man named Philippides. For a long time, scholars disbelieved the story of the Athenian runner, but in 1982 AD this was done again by a British Royal Air Force officer who wanted to test Herodotus' claim. He and a friend ran the 153 miles in just under 36 hours. The Athenians, in a bloody contest, defeated the Persian army in the Battle of Marathon northeast of Athens, this being the origin of the marathon race. In the battle, the Greeks lost 192 men, but they had killed 6,400 soldiers of the Persian forces, according to Herodotus. This reveals that the Greeks killed 33.3% more Persians than the Persians killed Greeks. The Persians retreated. When the Spartans arrived, soon after the battle, in awe they beheld a vast plain filled with the dead. 1. The naked Olympics. 2. History in quotations. 3. A short history of the world. 485 BC, 3410 AM. The first regnal year of Xerxes of Persia. This was actually Xerxes II. The first Xerxes was a king of Assyria over 13 centuries earlier. A foundation tablet of Persepolis belonging to Xerxes reads, quote, I am Xerxes, great king, king of kings, the king of all countries which speak all kinds of languages, the king of the entire big far-reaching earth, unquote. At this time the priestly Magi raised to prominence in Persia, a sect having their origin in India. For unknown reasons at this time, the Magi emerged affluent throughout Persia and Media, became supervisors of the educational systems, even tutoring the children of kings. The Magi had grown so respected and powerful that Zoroastrian became the state religion, later in 226 BC. The Zoroastrian beliefs are so parallel to the ancient Israelite faith and later Christian faith that it appears that the beliefs of the Magi at this time were revived by the influx of the Israelites among the Persians and Medes. The sudden appearance of the Magi in the East and the origin of the word Magi, meaning slave, links them to the deported Israelites settled among the Easterners. Reviled by some, they were respected by all. It was the Magi that watched for the signs of the Saviour. This was the approximate time of Euripides, who authored the Electra. 1. Secrets of Time. 2. History in quotations. 3. Zoroastrianism. 482 BC, 3413 AM. Responding to a revolt in Babylon, the Persians tore down the fortifications of Nebuchadnezzar II, the famous 300-foot-high ziggurat pyramid, Esagila, or Temple of Marduk. This was 132 years, 1584 months, 792 plus 792, after 614 BC, when the Medes formed an alliance with Babylon against the Assyrian Empire. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 481 BC, 3414 AM. Xerxes, son of Darius, assembled the largest army the world had ever seen until that time, which passed over the Dardanelles by way of a bridge of boats after King Xerxes visited the ancient Troy, the city famous for the Trojan War. His Magi sacrificed 1,000 cattle to the spirits of the ancient Trojan heroes. Then the Persian army marched on into Greece. The Greek states formed the Hellenic League at a congress convened at the old city of Corinth, delegating the defence of the realm to the leadership of the warlike Spartans. In response to the consultation of the Delphic oracle, Themistocles paid for a fleet of warships from the money acquired by a rich load of silver discovered at Laurion. Under Xerxes, the Persian army marched into Greece with many auxiliaries from the nations of the empire, many of them descendants of Judah and Israel, as an eclipse darkened the sun. Herodotus in the Histories wrote that the Persians saw this omen favourably because the moon covered the sun a Grecian symbol, while the moon was venerated in the east. Strangely, right before the battle at Salome, a giant of a man named Artachaeus, who stood 8 foot 2 inches tall, died of a sickness, a man of the famous Persian Achaemenid family. At Thermopylae, a force of 1,400 Spartans under Leonidas held a tiny pass the Persian army sent to enter, and these 1,400 men lost their lives in a flurry of unsurpassed violence that inflicted enormous casualties upon the Persian army, severely wounding their morale as the Spartans held the pass. It was learned that tens of thousands of able-bodied Greeks were off at Olympia, assembled during the end of the Olympic Games to observe a famous wrestling final, and were not overly concerned about the Persian presence. One of Xerxes' generals asked in shock, quote, "What sort of men have you brought us to fight?" unquote. The battle for Thermopylae gave rise to the legend of the 300. According to Josephus in his Antiquities, the Spartans, once called the Lacedaemonians, were kin to the Jews and were of the stock of Abraham. In fact, the seal of Sparta was the same as the seal of the Israelite tribe of Dan, an eagle with a serpent in its claws. This would later appear on the military standards of the United States of America. Humbled by the Spartan resistance, the Persians made it through Thermopylae and advanced on Thebes, which surrendered. Themistocles informed the Athenian government that the Delphic oracle predicted the fall of Athens, but also declared that victory would fall to the Greeks if they relied on, quote, the wooden walls, unquote. As the walls of Athens were stone, this was interpreted to mean that they would gain the upper hand by their navy. As the Persians neared Athens, it was burned down and evacuated. The Athenian army then met the superior navy of the Persians at Salamis, and Xerxes watched in disbelief as his ships were systematically destroyed. This occurred during the archonship of Calliades. On land, the Persians did not fare well either. Without a navy with which to ship over food and supplies, Xerxes retreated back into Asia with half of his surviving army, leaving the other half camped at Plataea. After the battle, some Greeks rummaged through the battlefield and found a Persian body that stood 7.5 feet tall. The Magonid general Hamilcar of Carthage led an invasion force of 300,000 men and landed in Sicily to attack the Greek cities of Syracuse and Acragas, two cities founded long ago by Ionian and Danaan Greeks. The Carthaginian army had contingents from North Africa, Spain, Gaul, Liguria and Sardinia. Amazingly, this massive invasion was repelled by these Greek cities, and the Greeks imposed a 20,000 silver talent fine for war reparations. Carthage would go on to leave the Greeks alone for 70 years. According to Greek historians Ephorus and Diodorus, this invasion was masterminded by the Persians. Carthage was on its way to housing 1 million people. From Carthage, with its dominant Phoenician Semitic population, much of it of Hebrew stock, sent out expeditions into the Atlantic that made it to the British Isles and Central America, where innumerous Phoenician relics and evidences have been discovered in modern times. Carthage maintained colonies throughout the Mediterranean, along the African coast and the coasts of the Atlantic along Africa and Europe. It is interesting that among all the nationalities that were led by the Carthaginians against the Greeks, not a Celt was among them. The Celts and Greeks were on the friendliest terms. Not even Xerxes had any Celts in his auxiliaries. As will be shown throughout the remainder of this chronology, the Celts were of direct Israelite descent. Their affinity toward the Greeks was more than neighbourly, a blood kinship. It was about this time that Protagoras was teaching that men were the measure of all things. This battle and series of battles and Greek victory was 930 years, 792 plus 138, after 1411 BC, when the Israelites began their conquest against the giant kingdoms of Og of Bashan and Sion of Argob. As the early Greeks were Ionian and Danaan Israelites, we are not surprised to find that this was 888 years after the Israelites sailed into the Aegean and landed on the ancient coast that would become the Greek world in 1369 BC. This was 480 years after the temple was finished in Jerusalem in 961 BC, and 240 years after the remaining Israelites were carried off into captivity by the Assyrians in 721 BC, after the fall of Samaria. This was 66 years, 792 months, after the burning of the Delphic Oracle Temple and its rebuilding in 547 BC, and 48 years, 576 months, after 529 BC, when Cyrus of Persia was killed and the Persians were defeated by the Massagetae Scythians, a people descended from Israel. Finally, the Greek victories are exactly 148 years, 776 months, to the fall of Persia by the Greek Macedonian army in 333 BC, led by Alexander of Macedon. 1. The Poison King. 2. Pliny, Natural History footnote. 3. Herodotus, The Histories Book. 4. The Naked Olympics. 5. Post-captivity names of Israel. 6. Secrets of Time. 7. The Histories Herodotus, Book 1x. 8. Phoenicians. 9. A Short History of the World. 10. Celtic Myths and Legends. 479 BC, 3416 AM. A united Greek force of over 100,000 men defeated the Persian occupation army camped at Plataea, and the Greek fleet destroyed the Persian fleet at Mycale in Asia Minor. Alexander I of Macedon aided Xerxes in his invasion against the Greeks, but after the Persian defeat at Plataea, he slaughtered many of the retreating Persians. The Macedonians were not Hellenes and were regarded at this time as little more than savages, northern barbarians. Alexander I was debarred from the Olympic Games until he came up with a genealogy showing his alleged Argead dynasty connection to the ancient Homeric Argive kings. His greatest military achievement was to lay the foundation in having Macedon accepted into the Hellenic family. This is 148 years, 1776 months, before Alexander of Macedon, called the Great, conquers the Near East and becomes the king of Macedon, Phoenicia, Egypt, Babylon and Persia. This year began Greekdom's position as a world power, independent of foreign intrusion. This was 776 years after the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae began in 1255 BC, an Israelite dynasty. The Olympiad calendar began in 776 BC, and the number 776 emerges many times in world timelines, involving the combined peoples of Greek and Israelite descent. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 476 BC, 3419 AM. At the Olympic Games, the Greeks celebrated their freedom, the festivities adding to the prestige of the Olympic festival. More people gathered for these games than in the history of the Olympics since 776 BC. They had triumphantly defeated both Persia and all her allies, as well as the Carthaginians of North Africa. Victorious, funds were gathered and a new temple of Jupiter was begun, completed in 459 BC, as well as a redesigned stadium. This was the 300th year of the Olympiad calendar, and its calendrics link it to ancient Israel. We have seen how the number 476 relates to Israel in several ways. One example is 1229 BC, when the Danaan aided the Mycenaeans and Greeks in the fall of Troy, 476 years before Israel's greatest enemy was born, in 753 BC, the Romans. In 476 AD, the Gothic descendants of the Scythian Israelites, Cimmerians, would defeat Rome, 1229 years after the founding of Rome. In this year at the Olympics, the Greeks literally became one people under the banner of Hellenes. The assimilation of Israelite-descended peoples so complete that throughout Greekdom there was no distinction between the indigenous Japhetic people and the Semitic ones. The Greek civilization we know was the combination of the two peoples. The patriarch Japheth was born in 2339 BC, and this year of Greek celebration and unity was 2339 years Anno Pyramid, the Great Pyramid being the seal of Israel, the Israelites being descended from the Sethite builders of the monuments. This year was also 931 years since Israel became a nation in Canaan, in 1407 BC, the year 931 BC being the year the Israelites created their own nation apart from that of Judah and Jerusalem, beginning the divided kingdom chronology, won the Naked Olympics. 474 BC, 3421 AM. The Sicilian Greeks destroyed an Etruscan fleet. 471 BC, 3424 AM. A Roman consul, after a military defeat, ordered every 10th soldier executed for lack of discipline. This is the first recorded instance of the Roman practice of decimation. This was the 38th year of the Republic of Rome. 1. History in quotations. 470 BC, 3425 AM. Xanthos of Lydia was the first Greek writer to mention Zoroaster. He placed this prophet, quote, 600 years before the Trojan War, unquote. As the Trojan War entered in 1229 BC, 600 years, which is an approximate figure only, would be 1829 BC, the exact time Abraham was teaching the sages of the East the prophetic texts and histories in Egypt, as well as translating the Giza texts off the surface of the Great Pyramid. Abraham was well remembered as Zoroaster. See 1837 and 1825 BC. This is the approximate date for the year that Socrates was born at Athens, the Athenian lawgiver, statesman and philosopher, immortalized by Plato. 1. Zoroastrianism. 467 BC, 3428 AM. Anaxagoras of Athens was about 35 years at this time, in the second year of the 78th Olympiad, when he predicted that in a certain number of days a stone would fall from the sky, which he deduced by his advanced knowledge on the motion of the heavens. As predicted, not only did a meteorite crash into Thracia by the river Agos, but that very night appeared a bright comet. This comet was of the Joshua Comet group, which was at that time passing over the ecliptic, after 220 years beneath the inner solar system. Anaxagoras was a student of Anaximenes. He was an Ionian who believed that the stars were faraway suns, that moonlight is merely reflected sunlight, that lunar eclipses are caused by the Earth's shadow, and that the moon is made of earth with plains and ravines on it. He believed that the mind was the mover of all things and is supreme in the universe, and that all sensation was by the stimulation of opposites. The doctrine of mind over matter finds its origin with Anaxagoras. He did not ascribe to the cosmologies of Homer and Hesiod. He was exiled later in life from Athens for denying the divinity of the sun. In this year, Aeschylus composed his famous Seven Against Thebes, concerning the Theban War of 1244 BC, which perhaps coincidentally was the year a comet was seen over Thebes. 1. 3 books on occult philosophy. Also Pliny Natural History, Universe and the World, the First Genesis. 2. History in Quotations. 3. Stolen Legacy. 4. Cosmos of the Ancients. 464 BC, 3431 AM. The first year of King Artaxerxes of Persia. A destructive earthquake afflicts Sparta and probably created the conditions by which the Helot rebellion occurred. This was 312 years, 52 times 6, after the Olympiad calendar began in 776 BC. 1. Secrets of Time. 460 BC, 3435 AM. Athens expands its domain and power and by force subdues Aegina and Boeotia, which become the subject of one of Pindar's odes. Athens makes war against its long-time mercantile rival, the city of Corinth, capturing the city and defeating its fleet. Sparta and Thebes declare war on Athens, beginning the First Peloponnesian War, which would last until 446 BC. Hippocrates was born, popularized as the father of medicine and the origin of the Hippocratic Oath. He died in 377 BC. 1. Wars that changed the world. 458 BC, 3437 AM. After considerable controversy over Jerusalem, King Artaxerxes I of Persia published an edict allowing for the rebuilding of the city. This begins the famous prophecy of the 70 weeks of the prophet Daniel, counting to the appearance of the Messiah when he is cut off or crucified. This is 490 years, 70 times 7 to 33 AD, 3927 AM. This year is 1440 years after the supremacy of Elam, ancient Persian ancestors, in 1898 BC over the West, Canaan and Egypt. 1. Ezra. 2. Secrets of Time. 3. Daniel. 457 BC, 3438 AM. The famous sculptor Phidias sculpts the gigantic statue of Zeus at Olympia. 455 BC, 3440 AM. Rome sent 3 representatives to Athens, Greece, to copy the laws of Solon and to acquaint themselves with Greek political institutions and bring the information back to the Senate of Rome. While they were away, a famine and plague afflicted Rome and surrounding country, men and livestock suffering equally. This was 800 years after the founding of the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae in 1255 BC. The connection being that Grecian political concepts would have been influenced by the early Israelite presence. This was the 54th year, half of 108 of Rome. 1. Livy. 451 BC. King Artaxerxes of Persia reconfirms his decree and order to rebuild Jerusalem, Ezra travels to Jerusalem to initiate the rebuilding. The prophetic text of Daniel reads, quote, "Know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks, 49 years, and 62 weeks, 434 years, or a period of judged time. Then after 62 weeks the Messiah will be cut off." Unquote. This is a total of 69 weeks from 451 BC, or 483 years until 33 AD, when the Messiah will be cut off. As this begins the 69-week countdown to the crucifixion, the 70 weeks began 7 years earlier, with the first decree to rebuild Jerusalem by Artaxerxes in 458 BC. This is approximately the time when Ezra by inspiration rewrote the Old Testament scriptures. While the Roman constitution is suspended, the government is run by the decemvirate, 10 men specially appointed to rule the people, men who quickly turned into the 10 tyrants, who began to oppress the people, even to the point of delaying the reappointment of the Constitution of Rome. While this suspension continues, others prepare the 12 tables, a law code the Romans developed after visiting other nations and studying their forms of government. This year was the 552nd year after the throne of David was established in Jerusalem in 1003 BC, and it was the 480th year of the divided kingdom. 1 Daniel, 2 Esdras. 450 BC, 34:45 AM. This is the approximate date for Herodotus of Halicarnassus, authoring his epic work, The Histories, a scholarly book on the history of the nations of the world, now 25 centuries old. This surviving work from the ancient world has provided historians a plethora of information and has earned Herodotus the title as the father of history. Herodotus travelled Greece, Phoenicia and Egypt and wrote, quote, "I record what people say, but I am by no means bound to believe it." Unquote. He wrote that Cheops was the 5th king of Egypt after Pharaoh Meres, a king who had been dead 900 years, which places him at about 1350 BC. This was 15 centuries after the acceptable dating of the Great Pyramid construction. That Cheops built the pyramid is a modern fiction, perpetuated for lack of an Egyptological acceptable theory. Herodotus visited the monument and was shown inscriptions upon its facing blocks, and was told by an Egyptian that the strange writings told of the king's expenses in building the monument. Herodotus was no fool and expresses doubt on this in his book. He also wrote that a vast network of galleries of rock and tunnels were underneath the Great Pyramid and Giza Plateau. The modern world would not receive confirmation of this until 1909 and 1926 AD. He also visited a very old temple in Phoenicia at Tyre that had 2 large twin pillars, one of gold and the other emerald. The motif was a popular one in the Near East, the twin pillar concept representing the 2 great pyramids at Giza, the Great Pyramid being the epicenter of the pre-flood world, the 0 degrees longitude and latitude, the prime meridian. The priests informed him that the temple had been erected 2,300 years earlier, but this was untrue, for 2,300 years earlier was about 2750 BC, which was about 65 years off from the date of the Great Pyramid's construction, which was what the temple was actually designed to mimic. Herodotus remarked in his work that the ground surrounding the Great Pyramid was covered with seashells and dead oysters upon sandy hills, that salt had exuded from the soil around Giza. This is remarkable, for he had no idea that the Goshen region where the Giza complex sat was under the sea for 340 years, and had only emerged after a series of quakes in 1899 BC, over 14 centuries before his writing The Histories. 1. The Histories, Book 4. 449 BC, 3446 AM. One of the tyrants of Rome, a member of the decemvirate, had fallen in love with a girl of rare beauty who was the daughter of a citizen soon to be married to a young man who was a friend of her father. The tyrant, named Appius, took the opportunity to take her by deceit when her father was out at war. In front of a large gathering his agents abducted her, proclaiming that the lass was not free-born but was actually born as a slave of Appius, that had been lost and given a new identity. a lie contrived to enslave her. In haste, men, disbelieving this fiction, carried the news to her father in the field, for an assembly of the people had gathered and held the girl under their ward until the dispute was resolved. Her father returned and argued that the scheme was a lie, but by force the tyrant had his agents take the girl. Begging the tyrant to give him a moment with his daughter before they took her away, in front of a large gathering, the tyrant relented. The man begged his daughter to forgive him as he explained to her that he would deliver her from this evil. He produced a dagger and stabbed her in the heart. The people were shocked, and already fed up with the decemvirate, the people of Rome revolted and overthrew them that year. The 12 tables of law were erected in a public place for all to know and read. This was the 60th year of the Republic of Rome, 1 Livy. 447 BC, 3448 AM. Work begins on the Parthenon in Athens, its designers being Ictinus and Callicrates. As this is 1,000 years after the freedom of the Israelites from Egypt in the Exodus in this year, the Boeotians earned their freedom from Athens in the Battle of Chaeronea after 13 years of submission. The Boeotians are descended from the Ionian Israelites. Ezra finished his composition of the Old Testament holy books. Clement of Alexandria wrote that Ezra was a Levite prophet who performed this task during the reign of Artaxerxes I of Persia. Ezra in a vision learned the history of the world, discovering that there was more history in the world's past than there was remaining in its future, and that the last days would be visited by evils that will exceed even humanity's trespasses in ancient times. Ezra received a vision of 5 beings who wrote 204 books. The first 134 books were made open to all men, but the final 70 books were hidden. This is an allusion to the 204 levels of the Great Pyramid when it is finished with its capstone. The monument is 203 courses of books, but when the chief cornerstone, the Messiah, descended from heaven in 2106 AD, the monument of man would be complete at 204 courses, the Great Pyramid once being the largest book on earth. The 134 books concerning the last days, which begin in 1902 AD, the date also singled out by Nostradamus as seen in Nostradamus and the Planets of Apocalypse. The year 1902 AD is the subject of When the Sun Darkens, concerning planet Phoenix. The 134 years is from 1902 AD to 2036 AD, and the final 70 years concerns the apocalypse, from 2036 to 2106 AD, ending with Armageddon. This year is 2000 plus 552 years before Armageddon, and 4000 plus 792 of the Anunnaki chronology. It was 918 years, 153 times 6, after the Israelite Danaan arrived in the Aegean and Asia Minor and the Peloponnesus in 1365 BC, and 480 years after the temple was sacked by the Egyptians in 927 BC. It was a period of judged time, 434 years after the founding of the Israelite city of Samaria in 881 BC, and 360 years after the founding of Macedon by descendants of Israel. It was 240 years after the Cimmerian Israelites settled in Phrygia in 687 BC, and exactly 138 years Phoenix orbit, 1656 months, after the fall of Judah in 585 BC. 1. The Naked Olympics. 2. Esdras. 3. Origin and evolution of Freemasonry. 445 BC, 3450 AM. Planet Phoenix passes through the inner solar system, completing its 138 years orbit. By this time it has fallen out of alignment with Earth's orbit around the Sun, so there is no direct transit, therefore no darkening of the Sun. Phoenix would cause major earthquakes from its proximity in 31 BC, 522 AD, and then be seen again as it partially obscures the Sun in 1764 AD, 2,208 years, 552 times 4 later. 439 BC, 3456 AM. The Greeks at Athens finished the Parthenon temple upon the Acropolis. Parthenon means virgin chamber, and embodied the concept of a god descending from heaven to lay with a priestess. This is significant because this was exactly 3,000 years, 600 times 5, since the Watchers descended from Nibiru in 3439 BC to take the daughters of men. This was the 4800th year, 600 times 8, of the Anunnaki chronology, 3600 years, 600 times 6, since the Anunnaki created modern Homo sapiens, in 4039 BC, and 1800 years after the deluge in 2239 BC. The Parthenon is 220 feet long, 77 feet wide, and 39 feet high, for a total volume of 660,660 feet. Dedicated to Athens, it also had carved into it elaborate scenes of the War of the Titans and Giants, east against the west, and the fall of Troy. This was exactly 800 years after the start of the Trojan War in 1239 BC. According to Plutarch, the statue of Athena in the Parthenon was the crowning achievement of Phidias. The great war involving the Titans and Giants concerns the most famous battle in the ancient world, the Battle of Kurusata in 1879 BC, the East against the West, which was 1440 years, 144 times 10, before the Parthenon was finished in this year. The ancestral history of the giants was of particular importance to the Greeks because Mycenae, their illustrious ancestors, was founded by the Anakim giants that were banished to the west long ago. Among the elaborate sculpted scenes on the Parthenon is a picture of Nereus, the archaic Grecian Noah, the survivor of the flood and the patriarch of the Anakim. The early Greeks were proud of this heritage, to be descended from Noah and Namar rather than through his sons Japheth, Shem or Ham. The Greek world we have come to know is that of assimilation with Israelite-descended peoples. The Parthenon is orientated toward the Pleiades stars, incorporating Phi within its dimensions, the golden proportion, the ratio of its height to its base being 5 to 8. This year is 684 years after Nibiru's last entrance into the inner solar system in 1123 BC, which may have been an underlying message of the Parthenon concerning the gods. Interestingly, this was also 684 years before planet Phoenix would pass through the inner solar system in 246 AD. Sir Norman Lockyer estimates that the Parthenon was built to commemorate an alignment of the rising of the Pleiades at about 1150 BC, only 27-year variance. The calendrics for this year go far beyond what has already been demonstrated. This was the year 3456 Anno Mundi, or 864 times 4, and in the Vedic calendar was 2664, or 666 times 4. It was 1460 years Sothic cycle, or 365 times 4 years after Babel, and 1008 years major golden proportion number after Exodus. This was the 1200th year since Ephraim and Manasseh in Egypt were adopted into the family of Israel in 1639 BC, and 972 years, 108 times 9, after Israel defeated and conquered the giants of Bashan and Argob under the Nephilim kings Og and Sihon in 1411 BC. This year was exactly 108 years before Nibiru would pass through the inner solar system in 331 BC, the year Alexander of Macedon was crowned king of Egypt, Phoenicia, Babylon and Persia. 1. Odyssey of the Gods. 2. History in quotations. 3. Return of the Serpents of Wisdom. 436 BC, 34:59 AM. The plague at Rome was at its worst. Odd and frightening things occurred in the skies and were attended by earth tremors and collapsing buildings in the country. This is the exact year of the return of the Joshua Comet group that had orbited the Sun north of the ecliptic now for 31 years. 1 Livy. 432 BC. The approximate date when the Greek astronomer Meton invented the Metonic cycle, which measured the times when the Sun and Moon are in the same position relative to the position of the stars. The cycle is 19 years or 235 lunar months. At the end of the cycle, the full moon appears on the same day of the year as it started at the beginning of the cycle. 431 BC, 3464 AM. The Second Peloponnesian War begins between Sparta and Athens. It would last 27 years to 404 BC. This was 50 years after the Greek victories over the invading Persians. 430 BC, 3465 AM. At Athens, only a minority of citizens presented themselves at the ecclesia, a general assembly where the policies of state were discussed and decided. The ecclesia antedates 430 BC and is the root word in the biblical book of Ecclesiastes. In this year a plague heavily afflicted Africa, Egypt and maybe even the East. This was 1447 years after 1877 BC, when the Abrahamic covenant was instituted, the year 1447 BC being the 10 plagues on Egypt in Exodus. This is the approximate date for Philolaus of Chronicon, about 40 years old, a Pythagorean philosopher, first one to state that Earth moves in a circle, an orbit. 1. The story of philosophy. 2. Cosmos of the ancients. 429 BC, 3466 AM. According to Thucydides, during the Peloponnesian War, a plague from Ethiopia plagued Athens as the Spartans sieged the city, killing the Athenian leader Pericles, exactly 800 years after the plague that afflicted Troy in the final year of the Trojan War in 1229 BC. The Trojan War was fought over the Hellespont and mercantile interests in the Black Sea, the same issues of the Peloponnesian War. This was the approximate date for birth of Plato, whose real name was Aristocles, famous philosopher and originator of the Platonic school. Plato was destined to become second in popularity through world history, only to one other philosopher, his student Aristotle. 428 BC, 3467 AM. The plague killed about 75,000 people in Athens during the Spartan siege. This was 816 years, or 9792 months, 2448 times 4, after the 7 against Thebes in 1244 BC, when the Thebans successfully defended themselves from an attack. The Thebans related by blood to Sparta. This was the 80th year of the democracy of Athens. In this year Anaxagoras died, c. 467 BC. 1. The Poisoned King. 426 BC, 3469 AM. 2 earthquakes afflicted the Peloponnesus. This was 7 50-year jubilees from the start of the Greek Olympiad calendar in 776 BC. 1. Wars that changed the world. 425 BC. The Phoenician admiral Hanno was sent out to establish new colonies and sailed along the African coast, past the Senegal River, Sierra Leone and Ghana to the Cameroons. He sailed from Tyre with a fleet of 60 ships carrying 30,000 men and women, with enough provisions for a 3,500-mile voyage. Each ship grossed 1,000 tons, this being 820 tons more than the Mayflower of the Pilgrims in 1620 AD. Amazingly, Hanno's logbook has been preserved. There is evidence from New York State that at least some of Hanno's fleet landed in North America. This would not have been the first Phoenician landing in the Americas. 1. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 421 BC. In the Treaty of Nicias, the Athenians lost control of the Delphic oracle to the Spartans, who now controlled the local Phocians, who maintained the oracle. This was 540 years, half of 1080, after the temple in Jerusalem was finished in 961 BC and 324 years after the Israelite tribes were carried into Assyrian captivity in 745 BC. Democritus and Leucippus theorize about this time that the entire universe is composed of unseen tiny particles, the origin of atomic theory. 1. The Greek myths. 413 BC, 3482 AM. During the Peloponnesian War between the maritime powers of Athens and Sparta, the Greeks of Syracuse, descended from Danaan Israelites, won a stunning defensive victory over the Athenians, according to Thucydides. This was 3896 years, 1948 plus 1948, of the Phoenix chronology, the sum of 1948 relating to Abraham and to Israel. 1. History in quotations. 406 BC. The Romans began warring against their centuries-old enemies, the Etruscans of the wealthy city of Veii, a siege that would endure for 10 years. This was the 103rd year of the Republic of Rome. 405 BC, 3490 AM. Until this year, the Athenians had enjoyed an unimpeded control of the Black Sea trade through the Hellespont, much in the exact way that the Trojans enjoyed until their fall 824 years earlier in 1229 BC. In this year, the Athenian fleet was totally destroyed. The Aegean supremacy of Athens ended with the close of the Peloponnesian War. This was 960 years after the Danaan Israelites settled in the Peloponnesus and Aegean coasts in 1365 BC, and 540 years, half of 1080, after 945 BC, when Solomon sold 20 Israelite cities to Phoenicia. It was also 476 years, merging of Greek and Israelite lines, after Samaria in Israel was built in 881 BC. 1. The Greek myths. 404 BC, 3491 AM. The Peloponnesian War ends completely with the fall of Athens to Sparta. An unusual reddish rain was noted in this year. This is the 11th year of the long Joshua Comet Group train. A married woman was hidden among the trainers' stands, watching the Olympics as her son competed. He won, and she was discovered when her robe tore. From that day on, trainers had to be as naked as the athletes. This was 840 years after the 7 against Thebes in 1244 BC. 1. The Naked Olympics. 403 BC, 3492 AM. China erupts into anarchy and wars. The age of warring states begun, lasting 182 years, until the establishment of the Qin dynasty gained supremacy over the other warring kingdoms in 221 BC. In this year, the first sections of the Great Wall of China are erected. This is exactly 720 years after Nibiru passed through the inner solar system and caused quakes and disasters in China, initiating the fall of the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty and the flight of 250,000 Chinese to ancient America by sailing over the Pacific. As the Vedic calendar of India was an Eastern calendar, we are not surprised to find this as the 2700th year of the Vedic timeline, or 32,400 months, 10,800 times 3. 401 BC, 3494 AM. A civil war in Persia against Artaxerxes was quelled. The insurgents dead, 10,000 Greek mercenaries under Xenophon are stranded near Babylon. They march all the way back to Greece, and the account of Xenophon became widely read literature, even studied by Alexander of Macedon. The Greek army led by Xenophon passed through Central Asia and collapsed after eating poisoned honey from a rhododendron forest. To Xenophon's relief, they recovered. Also in this year, the rebuilding of the Jewish temple is complete, now located on Elephantine Island in Egypt. This was 560 years, 70 times 8 after the completion of the temple in Jerusalem in 961 BC, and the destruction of the temple in 585 BC by the Babylonians, 184 years, 2208 months, 552 times 4. Many people living in Persia were of Israelite stock, and this revolt was 480 years after the founding of the Israelite capital city Samaria in 881 BC. After an extremely cold winter of dense snows and a summer of unprecedented heat, the plague in Rome became critical. Even the prison was emptied out, and through the following years of 400 and 399 BC, the plague and inclement weather conditions were largely viewed as the wrath of God. This is 828 years, 414 plus 414, after the fall of Troy, the ancestors of the Romans, and it is the 108th year of the Republic of Rome, founded in 509 BC. 1. The Poisoned King. 2. The Jesus Papers. 3. Livy. 400 BC, 3495 AM. The approximate date for when Thucydides wrote his monumental historical book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, writing, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." Thucydides wrote that the lands of the Hellenes had no settled population, instead being a place of several migrating peoples. Even during the Trojan War over 8 centuries earlier, they were not known as Hellenes. At about this year, Theopompus wrote that Silenus cited evidence of the existence of a great continent that lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean, America. 1. History in quotations. 3. Atlantis, mother of empires. 399 BC, 3496 AM. Roman Senate order the consultation of the Sibylline books in the 110th year of the Roman Republic. The books of the Sibyl were said by some to be of ancient Hebrew prophetic works. Plato was 28 years old when Socrates drank hemlock and died, an act of principle after a sham trial, convicting him of a ridiculous offence. Plato and other young philosophers fled the city of Athens and travelled to Megara, where they took up with Euclid. Plato would not return to Athens for 12 years. It was because Plato's own writings became world famous that we know anything about Socrates, his teacher. Socrates was born at Athens. He taught his students to listen to the voice of the wise rather than the voice of the rabble, and he believed that the threat of death should not deter one from speaking the truth. He taught that an unexamined life is not worth living. His teachings and following invoked animosity from the ruling elite of Athens, who sought to censor him. The savant was threatened and still refused to be silenced. He was falsely accused, tried and convicted of fictitious crimes against the state. Many of his accusers thought the matter had gone too far when Socrates refused to budge from his position and take the outs they had offered him from prosecution. He willingly drank hemlock poison as his method of execution and died surrounded by friends and family when he drifted off to sleep. 1. The Oxford Illustrated Companion to 2. Stolen Legacy. 396 BC, 3499 AM. Because of a technicality granting Olympic wins to chariot owners as well as drivers, a woman competed for the first time in the all-male Olympics. Driving her own chariot, Spartan Princess Seneca won the chariot race, a very violent event. She won again 4 years later. The Etruscan city of Veii falls to Rome after 10 years of siege, having inflicted more losses on Rome than the Romans did against Veii. This has been likened by some historians to the 10-year siege of Troy by the Greeks, even the defeat of Veii mirroring the fall of Troy, a stratagem succeeding when force could not. It is interesting that both peoples, Trojans descended from Japheth and the Etruscans of Semitic origin, would fall in this way, both times leading to a cultural, racial assimilation between Japhetic and Semitic people. 1. The Naked Olympics. 2. Livy. 394 BC, 3501 AM. During the Battle of Cnidus between Spartans and other Greeks, a meteorite appeared like a beam in the sky as the Spartan fleet was defeated. This was the 10th year of the 11-year-long train of the Joshua Comet Group. 1. Pliny, Natural History, the Universe and the World. 392 BC, 3503 AM. Former Macedonian king Amyntas, the nephew of Perdiccas, with aid of the Thessalians, reacquired the throne. He is the father of Philip II, who was the father of Alexander the Great. Thessaly was more akin to Macedon than any other Greek state. It was from Thessaly that Hellenic culture emerged and spread out to encompass the whole of Greece. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 391 BC, 3504 AM. According to Livy, an evil star appeared over Rome, and reports filtered into the area of a mighty people from the north, who were invading northern Italy, besieging the Etruscan city of Clusium. The Romans sent ambassadors to make peace with the strangers, called Gauls, Celts, and Senones, all three names referring to the same people. But the Romans played the Celts falsely after making peace, being seen by Celts in acts of violence against their kinsmen. When news reached the rest of the Gauls that the Romans spoke peace but spilled blood, the Celts prepared for invasion of Rome. Adding insult to injury, the Celts then learned that the men who played them false were elevated in social status in Rome for their role of treachery. Priorly having no intention of entering Roman territory, this episode resulted in the Gallic invasion of Rome. In wrath, the horde of Gauls marched deeper into Italy, overrunning every settlement and town on their way. The stealth of the invasion caught the Romans by surprise. and the Gauls were 11 miles away from Rome before Rome was able to send out an army in their defence. The Romans were terrified at the sight of mighty tall warriors with long beards, strange heavy weapons, war hammers and battle axes, speaking and chanting an alien tongue, of ferocious appearance and demeanour and seemingly undisciplined. The savage military tactics were too much for the Romans, who instantly fled. Almost half of the Roman army slaughtered in their retreat, just north of the city along the Allia River. The Gauls entered a deserted and silent city of magnificent Roman architecture, streets paved with stones. With gates wide open, they at first thought it was a trap. Most of the Roman population, women and children, with many younger men, were holed up in the citadel or the capital. The warlike Gauls stumbled in masses down the streets, bewildered at the sight of many old men who just stared at them from windows and balconies in the streets and courts. These were those who were not permitted to enter the citadel for their age and lack of room. The Gauls let them be as they sacked the entire city until an old man attacked a Celt, which resulted in the death of all Romans in the city outside the citadel, which the Celts tried but could not breach. The Gauls departed the city after 4 days with their treasures and fought a series of battles with local peoples, even returning to Rome and occupying parts of it. This was a dark stain on the Republic, and false traditions were invoked, claiming that Romans amassed another army and drove away the Gauls, but this was untrue. The Celts would occupy the region and city for over 3 years before finally departing. However, they remained in Italy for a long time. In Calendrix, this year is one specifically related and connected to ancient Israel in several ways. This is because the origin of the Celts and Gauls were a people descended directly from Israel. The greatest number in Calendrix associated with Israel is 2448, the Hebrew or Annus Mundi years of 1447 BC, the exodus of Israel from Egypt. In the year 1056 AM, 2839 BC, the patriarch Noah was born in the first year of the oppression of the Nephilim before the flood. This year of the Gallic invasion of Rome was 2448 years since Noah's birth in 2839 BC in the oppression, and 1056 years after the Exodus in 1447 BC. This year was the 864th year from the founding of the Danaan Israelite dynasty of Mycenae in 1255 BC, a different branch of ancient Israelites known as the Ionians. This was the 612th year, 7344 months is 2448 times 3, after the throne of David established in 1003 BC, and 540 years, half of 1080, since Israel became a nation in 1407 BC, with the conquest of Canaan, and 490 years, 70 times 7, after the capital city of Israel, Samaria, was built in 881 BC. This is also the 330th year, 3960 months is 795 times 5, after the last of the 10 tribes of Israel were deported into Assyria. The first mention of the Celts in the ancient world was circa 500 BC by the Greek geographer Hecataeus. Later, Ephorus in about 350 BC wrote that the Celts and the Greeks had many of the same customs. The Gauls were interchangeably called Celts, and it was universally recognised in antiquity that they were one and the same people. The ancient Celtic calendar was a relic from Hebrew antiquity, dividing the year into lunar months and counting time by the reckoning of nights instead of days. This was a Mosaic institution borrowed from the older Babylonian, Sumerian and antediluvian civilization. In Genesis we read that, quote, "The evening and the morning were the first day," unquote, time reckoned by a preceding darkness that begins the day. The Celts of old claimed to have been descended from a race divided into 12 tribes. One of their chief patriarchs was Manaz. Manaz is none other than the ancient Hebrew patriarch Manasseh of the tribe of Joseph, who were destined to migrate ever westward, a people who would move on to the furthest west part of continental Europe, Gaul, ancient France and Spain, and then many centuries later they would sail over the Atlantic and found the United States of America. The Celtic Gauls occupied northern Italy for a time before branching out, many settling Asia Minor and founding Galatia. Asia Minor exported Ionian and Danaan Israelite fleets for centuries, and in late history it would export Celtic people, also descended from Israel. Galatia lay at the heart of Asia Minor, and during the Assyrian and Persian empires, this region was occupied by the populous Scythians or Cimmerians of Samaria. From Galatia they would move in waves of settlers that would found Galilee, Gilead and Golanitus. The term Galatian derives from the Babylonian word for prisoners, Galutha. Scholars assert that the mass of Judah and Benjamin remained in Media after the Babylonian captivity, returning to the region of Galilee. Remember, Jesus of Galilee was of the royal house of Judah. The message of Christianity was to be taken to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and one of the principal books that contained this message to these people was the book of Galatians. The 7 Christian churches were in Asia Minor in Greece, this being because the elements of the Christian faith are actually a revival of ancient Israelite faith. The Sinoan Celts that invaded Rome were direct descendants of Israelites, for the Sinoan term is the Latin for the Hebrew tribe of Simeon. The Celts strongly believed in the immortality of the soul, and it was definitely a parallel to the early Israelite habit that the Celts took great care in their art to avoid any representation of the natural forms in the plant and animal world. The injunction against image-making was strict in the Old Testament, akin to idolatry, and this adherence to this law is characteristic of Celtic art. 1. Livy. 2. Celtic myths and legends. 3. Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome. 6. The Philosopher and the Druid. 7. Caesar against the Celts. 8. Sacred Number. 9. Northern Mysteries and Magic. 10. A Short History of the World. 11. The Dragon Legacy. 12. Tracing Our Ancestors. 387 BC, 3508 AM. Over 3 years after the initial sack of Rome by the Celts in 391 BC, Marcus led a Roman army and drove the Sinoans back into the northern areas of Italy. This is the Roman version. Some historians believe that the Gauls departed as conquerors and the account of the Roman army was a fiction to save national face. What is certain is that the Sinoans were not finished, and nor did the Romans slaughter Brennus's men. The Celts stayed in Italy for almost a century afterward, remaining a constant threat. This was the year 1400, 700 times 2, since the birth of Jacob, Israel, in 1787 BC, and 868 years, 434 times 2, after the founding of the Danaan Israelite dynasty of Mycenae in 1255 BC. 540 years, half of 1080, after Jerusalem was sacked by the Egyptians in 927 BC. As the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 391 BC was 864 years, foundation of time number, after the Danaan dynasty was founded, 1255 BC, at Mycenae, which was an ancient Israelite line. This year of 387 BC counts down 864 years to the fall of Rome in 476 AD by the Germans, who were post-captivity descendants of Israel. Also in this year, militant Sparta forces the Hellenic states into a settlement with Persia, known as the Peace of Antalcidas, which ceded the Greek cities of Asia Minor to Persia, a humiliating affair. The loss of Ionian freedom gave rise to serious deliberations concerning a pan-Hellenic alliance against Persia. That this occurred in this year is supported in the calendrics, for the Ionian states were founded by migrating Israelites. Plato founded his famous academy, the first of its kind, a philosophical and scientific school that would survive over 900 years. Plato was of great strength of character, a brilliant orator, a painter, a poet, cosmologist, historian, grammarian, scientist, and had been a popular wrestler at the Pythian Games. Fearless debater, and his works continue today, having inspired thousands of authors and later philosophers. 1. History and the Quotations. 2. The Philosopher and the Druids. 3. Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome. Dialogues of Plato. 5. The Story of Astrology. 384 BC, 3511 AM. Aristotle is born in the Macedonian town of Stagira. Aside from Plato, his mentor and teacher, he was the most famous of all Greek philosophers, author of many very sophisticated books on philosophy, geography, and Western thought. Aristotle was at odds with many of Plato's teachings and perspectives, and was also the teacher of the famous Alexander of Macedon. 380 BC, 3515 AM. Approximate date for when Babylonian astronomer Kidinu calculated the lunar month to within 1 second of its true length. 1. Egypt, Greece and Rome. 372 BC, 3523 AM. A king of Cyprus besieged the city of New Tyre, the centre of Phoenician government and culture. Exactly 200 years prior, Nebuchadnezzar II quit the siege, unable to take the well-fortified island that was built in 1230 BC. For 858 years, the city of New Tyre had been free of any successful attack, but in this year of 372 BC, the king of Cyprus took New Tyre, but did not occupy it long at all. Very little is known of this defeat, but Cyprus was a main gateway through which Israelite fleets had passed through over 9 centuries. This begins a 40-year countdown to 332 BC, when Alexander of Macedon would successfully destroy New Tyre. 1. Alexander the Great. 371 BC, 3524 AM. A comet appeared, and according to Ephorus of Cyme, who witnessed it, the comet split into 2 comets. The Spartans attacked Thebes in Boeotia, and at the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban soldiers called the Sacred Band, elite warriors, defeated the Spartans. This win shocked the Greek world, for until this battle it was held that the Spartans were unconquerable. This was 110 years after the Spartans under Leonidas fought the Persians at the pass of Thermopylae, and 108 years after 479 BC when the Spartans, Thebans and Greeks all fought and defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. This was 560 years, 70 times 8, after Israel and Judah split into 2 kingdoms in 931 BC, and 868 years, 434 times 2, after the start of the Trojan War in 1239 BC, and 350 years, 7 jubilees of 50 years each, after the last of the 10 tribes were deported from Israel by the Assyrians in 721 BC. 1. Introduction to Comets. 367 BC, 3528 AM. The Peloponnesian League of Greek states is dissolved, paving the way for Macedonian supremacy. This is a very significant year calendarically, as the 3672nd year of orbital chronology. This is exactly half of the entire 7344 years, 2448 times 3, from the start of the Anunnaki chronology in 5239 BC to the return of the chief cornerstone in 2106 AD to destroy the Anunnaki. This period of 7344 years is 2448 times 3, the year 2448 being the year of the Exodus in 1447 BC, and this year is 2448 Anno Pyramid. It is also 1872 years after the flood, or 144 times 13. The Great Pyramid was finished in 2815 BC, or 1080 Annus Mundi, and this year is 1080 years after Exodus. As this relates to the Peloponnesian League, it is no mystery why this is 888 years, golden proportion number, after the founding of the Danaan dynasty of Mycene in the Peloponnesus, an Israelite dynasty in 1255 BC. In this same year, Plato accepts Aristotle as his student. 361 BC, 3534 AM. 30 years after the Gallic invasion of Rome and sack of the city, the Romans and Celts engaged in a battle. An enormous Gaul challenged the Roman army under the heroic code to single combat over the control of a bridge near a Gaulish town. The Romans feared these Celts because of their enormous bodies, but Titus Manlius answered the call, and to the amazement of both armies, the smaller man stuck his sword into the huge Celt's groin around his shield, felling him. Honouring the code, the Gauls ceded the bridge over to the Romans. This was exactly 360 years after the last of the 10 tribes were carried away into Assyrian captivity in 721 BC, where the Israelites became the Celts. 1. The Philosopher and the Druid. 359 BC, 3536 AM. The king of Macedon, Perdiccas, marched against Illyria, leaving Philip to rule Macedon in his absence, his 24-year-old little brother. But Perdiccas was killed in battle and his army slaughtered, leaving Philip as king of Macedon. The Athenians tried to back a man named Argaeus to rule Macedon, but Philip defeated him in battle. Philip as a youth received his military training at Thebes, where he was a hostage, taught by the great military strategist Epaminondas. Philip was an educated man aware of the writings of Herodotus, Isocrates and Xenophon, and he studied the plausibility of a conquest of Asia by a confederation of Greek nations. Philip designed the Macedonian phalanx system of infantry and essentially invented modern cavalry by training mounted fighters to fight as a unit instead of a mass of horsemen. His archers were instructed to shoot not men in chariots or on horses, but the animals themselves. Philip emerges quickly as a major Greek power as he begins solidifying alliances, one such alliance resulting with his marriage to Olympias, a princess of the kingdom of Epirus, a rival state. She is described as ruthless and sometimes deranged, full of hatred for Philip because as a princess of Epirus, she is an outsider and easily replaced with a Macedonian woman should Philip seek one. She will become the mother of Alexander the Great. The importance of this year to ancient Israel is clearly seen in the calendrics. The Jewish calendar began from the reckoning of years before the flood, or put another way, from the start date of some now forgotten calendar. That was 3671 BC, or 3312 years before this date, being 552 times 6, or 414 times 8, or 24 complete orbits of Phoenix every 138 years. The ancient Aegean world was ruled by the Israelite Danaan dynasty of Mycene that was founded in 1255 BC, exactly 448 years before the year Macedon was founded in 807 BC, and 448 more years after the founding of Macedon was this year of 359 BC, when Macedon begins its empire. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 2. The 33 strategies of war. 3. A short history of the world. 356 BC, 35:39 AM. Myrtale, a princess of the Molossian dynasty of Epirus, now called Olympias of Macedonia, wife of Philip, gives birth to Alexander. Historians claim strange omens appeared in the skies at the birth of Alexander, but this may be nothing more than retrospective enhancement. Alexander would grow up to forever change the demographics of the ancient world, his life forged before his birth in the annals of biblical prophecy. From his birth counting 2400 years, 600 times 4, the Western world would rule and govern over the global affairs of mankind, everywhere the descendants of Israel dwelt. Following Macedon, the Romans would rule and then fall by the Germans, then the various European powers until in the last days in 2046 AD, the entire Western world would end. See Anunnaki Homeworld and Nostradamus and the Planets of Apocalypse. In this year, the magnificent temple of Diana, Artemis, at Ephesus was burnt down, 195 years after it was finished, the temple taking 120 years to finish. This year is exactly 210 years, 70 times 3, 2520 months, before the fall of Macedonia and Greece to Rome in 146 BC. 1. Pliny, Natural History, footnote 3. 349 BC, 35:46 AM. In this the third year of the 107th Olympiad, as King Philip of Macedon was causing chaos throughout Greece, the sky appeared to open up and spew blood and fire upon the land. In this year, the Sodom-Trojan Apocalypse comet group appeared in the inner solar system after 280 years over the ecliptic. This was 3960, 792 times 5 years of Phoenix chronology, and 396, half of 792, after the Assyrians carried the Israelites into captivity in 745 BC. This was 3024 years, 1008, major golden proportion number, of Olmec calendar, and 880 years, 80 times 11, after the fall of Troy, when the same astronomical occurrences happened in 1229 BC. 1. Pliny, Natural History, the Universe and the World. 348 BC, 35:47 AM. Carthage and Rome enter into a treaty over trade boundaries, with Carthage exercising dominance in the negotiations. 1 Phoenicians. 347 BC, 3548 AM. Famous Greek philosopher and writer Plato died in his study, his head lying upon the open book of Sophron. Aristotle was 37 years old. Alexander was 9 years old. 1 The Story of Astrology. 346 BC, 3549 AM. The local Phocians took control over the Delphic oracle and temple, which had been their responsibility since ancient times. The Delphic oracles was the pride of the Phocians, but 75 years earlier the Spartans wrested away control of the Phocians from Athens in 421 BC, this 75 years being 900 months. Since then, an interstate religious body called the Amphictyonic Council was responsible for the administration of the Delphic oracle, a constant wound to the Phocians. After the Phocians took back the oracle, the council appealed to King Philip of Macedon, who was emerging as the dominant power of Greekdom. He defeated the Phocians in what has now been called the Sacred War, becoming the most powerful ruler in all Greece. Later that year, Isocrates published his address to Philip, calling him to lead a pan-Hellenic war against Persia. 1 Alexander of Macedon. 345 BC, 3550 AM. In the 14th year of Artaxerxes Ocus III of Persia, his army leaves Babylon and invades Phoenicia, capturing Sidon, sending the inhabitants to Babylon. This is 252 years after the Babylonians invaded last time under Nebuchadnezzar II. In that year, 597 BC, Judahites were deported to Babylon. This time it's Phoenician Western Semitic people who are partially descended from Israelites. This is exactly 600 years after Solomon sold 20 Israelite cities in 945 BC to Phoenicia. This was 270 years, 90 times 3, after 615 BC, when Persia defeated Assyria, and 240 years, 2880 months, after the fall of Judah by Babylon in 585 BC. This was the 400th year since the Assyrians deported the Israelites into the east in 745 BC, just as the Persians deported the Phoenicians into the east in this year. 1 Alexander of Macedon. 343 BC, 3552 AM. Something momentous occurred somewhere in the world as seen clearly in these amazing calendrics. As 3552 Annus Mundi this year was 1776 plus 1776, 3552. This was 2448 years before Armageddon, and it was the 4896th year, 2448 plus 2448, of the Anunnaki chronology, or 66.6%, all the way through the historical timeline, until their defeat at Armageddon in 2106 AD. This was 2760, 552 times 5, of the Vedic calendar of the East, and 1104 years, 552 plus 552, since the exodus of Israel and the 10 plagues of Egypt in 1447 BC. It is more than likely that whatever occurred in this year happened in India, the Orient, or ancient America. 341 BC, 3554 AM. King Artaxerxes of Persia occupied Egypt, which had revolted from Persian control between 410 to 404 BC. This invasion by Persia into Egypt was foreshadowed by the Elamite, ancient Persian ancestors' invasion of Egypt in 1898 BC, this year of Artaxerxes' invasion being 1898 after the flood. This was also 888 years after the Sea People Federation invaded Egypt in 1229 BC at the end of the Trojan War. Philip of Macedon hired Aristotle to tutor his son Alexander, aged 15. Aristotle was now 43. Alexander began to learn the sciences, mathematics, history, and philosophy. This is the approximate date for the birth of Epicurus, founder of Epicurean philosophy, which praised the tenet of those who chose to live unknown. 338 BC, 3557 AM. Philip of Macedon defeats Thessaly, a people akin to Macedon, and the origin of the Hellenic race, who settled the region after migrating from Asia Minor and before that from Palestine. On August the 4th, Philip and his son Alexander, 18 years old, went on to lead the Macedonian army against the combined armies of Athens and Thebes in the Battle of Chaeronea, the young Alexander leading the cavalry. Athens, Thebes, and other cities were then forced to join the League of Corinth, subject to Macedon. A fascinating Chinese text, dated 338 BC, is called Classic of Mountains and Seas, a work that describes kangaroos and boomerangs of Australia. This year was 66 years, 792 months after the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, when Athens fell to Sparta. 337 BC, 3558 AM. Philip II of Macedon influences the Greek city-states to form the Hellenic League. Macedonia under Philip was the first European territorial state with an effectively centralised political, military and administrative structure to come into being. Philip II brought the Greek world together just as King David brought the Israelite tribes together under one government 666 years earlier in 1003 BC, when he established the throne of David at Jerusalem. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 336 BC, 3559 AM. A congress of all the Greek states makes Philip II of Macedon the general of a Greco-Macedonian army, a confederacy against Persia. Philip II builds an army and sends it into Asia Minor. He had a statue of himself made and included among those statues representing the immortals, with Zeus at Olympias. Philip makes an unwise move and takes another wife, a Macedonian woman. She is with child, and this will ruin Alexander, who was born to Olympias, a princess of Epirus. At his marriage ceremony, Philip II is assassinated by Pausanias, an attractive nobleman, who had years before been raped by a man that Philip later promoted to governor of a Grecian province, a man named Attalus. Most believe the murder was a revenge killing set up by Olympias, a theory also ascribed to by the European historian Machiavelli. He was killed with a Celtic sword. Olympias could not allow Philip to marry the woman, for it would produce an heir to the throne of pure Macedonian blood. In this year the Persian king was also assassinated, Artaxerxes III Ocus, ending the line of the Achaemenid kings of Persia. The news reaches Greece. The Grand Vizier named Bagoas sets up a royal military veteran named Kodaman as king, who assumed the dynastic title of Darius III. Interestingly, the name Darius was the name of the first and last kings of Persian-controlled Babylon. 1. Alexander the Great. 2. Machiavelli Discourses, Book 2. 335 BC, 3560 AM. The ancient city of Thebes of the Seven Gates of pre-Trojan war fame is razed by Alexander of Macedon, totally destroyed, and all of its citizens killed and sold off into slavery, its domains divided among neighbours. The fall of Thebes shocked the Greek world with fear of Alexander. This was exactly 144 years after the Battle of Plataea, when the Greeks defeated the Persians. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 334 BC, 3561 AM. The rise and career of Alexander of Macedon is detailed in biblical prophecy. He being the notable horn and the goat of Grecia, the king of the west, the prophecy stating that his rise against Persia, the bear, beginning a 2300-year countdown to when the sanctuary would be restored. This 2300 years began in 334 BC and ended in 1967 AD, when in the Six-Day War the Islamic nations of Jordan, Syria and Egypt attacked Israel, and the Israelis defeated them all and even took back the Temple Mount sanctuary. The prophecy as recorded in Book of Daniel relates that its fulfillment is in the end times. Serving under Alexander were the elite Macedonian fighting forces trained by his father Philip II. One of Alexander's trusted men was Laomedon, a man whose name derived from ancient Persian Elamite history. During the Great War between the East and West, the king Chedorlaomer of Genesis 14 fame. It is not surprising in this light to learn from records at that time that Laomedon even spoke Persian. Alexander assembled his invasion force in this year and began moving east. This was 156 years, 1872 months, is 144 times 13, after Darius of Persia invaded the west and attacked Greece in 490 BC, and 160 years, 40 times 4, after the Persians captured the Ionian city of Miletus in 494 BC. At the Danube River that separates Europe and Asia, Alexander received Celtic emissaries. Their apparel was very odd to the Greeks and rest of the world, for the Celts did not wear robes and kilts as did the men of all nations. The Celts had invented pants. After drinking and conversing for a spell, Alexander asked these mighty men what it was that they feared. Their leader soberly replied, "Nothing. We fear nothing at all, except that the sky might fall on our heads." This was one of the earliest recorded encounters between the Greeks and the Celtoi. Until this period, the Celts were largely unmentioned in Mediterranean texts. Alexander had no idea that he was of the blood of ancient Israel, did not know the relevance of Israel and the prophecies attached to these people, nor that the Celts were another branch of his same race. The Greek world was populated by ancient Ionian and Danaan Israelites from over 1,000 years priorly, but the Celts, Gauls, Scythians and Cimmerians were of the post-captivity branches of Israel, having no idea they were all branches from the same trunk. Alexander crossed into Asia Minor and defeated a larger force of Persians in the Battle of Granicus. He then captured several cities and wisely tore down the coastal garrisons of Asia Minor, knowing that the Persians had sea superiority, leaving no hostile port to his rear. 1. Daniel. 2. Alexander of Macedon. 3. The Philosopher and the Druid. 5. A Short History of the World. 333 BC, 3562 AM. Alexander made a pilgrimage to Troy. His biographers claim that he took a copy of Homer's Iliad everywhere he went, even on this Asian campaign. King Darius rushed out with a truly massive army against Alexander and his Macedonians. Though badly outnumbered, the Macedonians slaughtered and then routed the Persian army, their allies, vassals and auxiliaries, cavalry and elephants. Darius fled the carnage, leaving behind his court entourage and wives and concubines, treasures and personal effects, sons and daughters. They were captured and treated with respect by Alexander. This was the Battle of Issus. Alexander captured Damascus, where Darius III held a treasury, and then almost immediately Sidon in Phoenicia and several other cities surrendered. Darius III sent a message to Alexander to honour the Code of Kings, asking for the return of his wives and concubines, sons and daughters. Alexander refused, informing Darius that this was a campaign of vengeance for Persia's inducing Greeks to fight Greeks, for attempting to assassinate his father Philip, and for the Persian invasions of Greece in the past, 491–479 BC. The fall of Western Asia to the Macedonians gave the Greeks much more control over the Aegean and Mediterranean. The Persians no longer ruled the seas, though they still retained their Phoenician ally Tyre. At Issus, Darius III's army was about 5 times the size of that of Alexander's, but the number of 600,000 troops may have been exaggerated. Macedonian propaganda. Either way, the victory lit a fire that spread throughout the Greek world. Alexander fell ill at Tarsus in Asia Minor, and his army tarried until he recuperated. In biblical prophecy, this victory over Persia was foretold in the vision of the he-goat killing the two-horned ram. The Battle of Issus was 252 years after the fall of Judah in 585 BC to Babylon, and 204 years, 2448 months, after the fall of Babylon to Persia in 537 BC. This was also 148 years, 1776 months after 481 BC, when the Greeks defeated the Persian army under Xerxes. 1. Alexander the Great. 5. Daniel. 332 BC, 3563 AM. Alexander occupies Sidon without incident. These people hated the Persians and they aided Alexander as a labour force. The Samaritans addressed Alexander, a people, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, who disliked them, who claimed direct descent from Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, saying that they were related to the Jews. Alexander asked them if they were Jews, to which they replied, quote, that they were Hebrews but had the name of Sidonians living at Shechem, unquote. Scholars have long known that, quote, the Israelites were not Jews, although some Jews may be Israelites, unquote. The term Good Samaritan derived from the fact that when the Judahites were driven out of Judah by the Babylonians, many took up residence among the Samaritans, living peaceably amongst them according to Josephus. In Jewish tradition, Alexander approached Jerusalem with an army, but the high priest went out, leading the people to tell Alexander that they had no quarrel with him. These stories tell that Alexander was shown the book of Daniel and read prophecies that concerned himself, that demonstrated that the Macedonian king was the he-goat of Scripture that would destroy Persia. The tradition that Alexander visited Jerusalem is not corroborated by any non-Jewish source on Alexander. He is said to have granted the Jews certain privileges because back in Macedon he had a vision wherein God petitioned him to attack Persia, thus aligning with what the Jewish priest told him. Alexander requested that the people of Tyre allow him to enter the impregnable city of New Tyre on the fortified island so he could sacrifice, but they refused him, claiming that he could sacrifice in Old Tyre on the coast. Alexander then set to the task of taking New Tyre without knowing he was going to fulfill an unbelievable biblical prophecy that claimed that Tyre would fall and be no more by a king of Babylon. Tyre was completely surrounded by high cliffs with walls at 150 feet high. Prior to the full embargo and siege, many Tyrians sent their families to Carthage on the North African coast. This being 240 years, 2880 months, after Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon totally destroyed Old Tyre on the mainland in 572 BC, which resulted in the autonomy of Carthage, which was originally a Phoenician colony. Alexander now demolished Old Tyre for rubble and received tens of thousands of the gigantic cedars of Lebanon, with many locals drafted into his labour force. Josephus wrote that Alexander received supplies and assistance from all the neighbouring cities. The people of Tyre watched amazed at the energy and ingenuity of the Macedonian engineers as they constructed their siege works. After erecting his siege towers, Alexander sent envoys asking for a peaceful settlement and surrender, but the Tyrians committed a grave error in killing his messengers, tossing their dead bodies off the walls. Alexander used the stones of Old Tyre to build a bridge from the mainland to the island, and to bomb New Tyre with engines crafted from the cedars of Lebanon. These siege engines incorporated new stone-throwing torsion springs that allowed them to fling large rocks through ranks of soldiers at 400 yards, 1,200 feet, or at 450 feet to inflict damage against walls and fortifications. Special ships were constructed on the spot, barges with flat decks all tethered together to form a floating foundation to a bridge, where his siege towers rolled into position as Alexander's navy battled the Phoenician ships. Tyre fell when Alexander's men stormed the city, killing 8,000 defenders and enslaving 30,000 more. For the death of his messengers, Alexander had 2,000 men of Tyre crucified along the shore. New Tyre fell to Macedon 252 years after Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon abandoned his siege of the island city after 13 years in 584 BC. This was a momentous event for Macedon and one reflected in its calendrics. In 812 BC, Carthage was founded as a Tyrian colony, this being 240 years before 572 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Old Tyre and Carthage was freed from Phoenician control. This was further 240 years before Alexander destroyed New Tyre in 332 BC. For the Greek world this was a decisive event, being the 444th year of their Olympiad calendar, from 776 BC, and being 144 years after 476 BC, when the entire Greek world celebrated their victory over both Persia and Carthage at the Olympic festival. This was exactly 40 years after New Tyre was defeated for the first time for a short time in 372 BC by Cyprus. When Tyre fell, every coastal town and city submitted to Alexander except the Philistine city of Gaza, a city in those days believed to be impregnable. The ruins of Tyre were so total that the region remained desolate and a favourite fishing spot, which is exactly what was foretold by the prophets. The fall of Tyre was retold through the courts of the ancient world, and every day ships and fleets from the Greek states flooded into the East Mediterranean ports. A curious situation, for these were people who had no memory that they were descendants of Israel, the land they now resettled in. Palestine at this time was literally filled with Greeks. In this year, the king of Macedon and son of Philip II became Alexander the Great. As Cyrus the Persian fulfilled prophecy and defeated the Lion of Babylon, Alexander defeated the Bear of Persia. As Alexander later is coronated as king of Babylon, he fulfilled the biblical prophecies concerning the fall of Tyre. The city of Gaza refused to surrender, and it took the Macedonian army 2 months to besiege and take it. Alexander had all 10,000 men slaughtered, their women and children sold into slavery. The taking of Gaza is considered by many historians as equal in magnitude to the taking of the sea-girt city of New Tyre. This effectively ended the Philistines, though the Philistine culture was already virtually extinct. Alexander moves onward into Egypt without a battle, and on November 14th he was declared Pharaoh of Egypt and king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now he was king of Macedonia, leader of the Greek League, ruler of Asia Minor, Ionic Greek states, the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, Egypt, and soon he would be crowned king of Babylon. This was 460 years, 5520 months, after the founding of the Ethiopic dynasty of Egypt in 792 BC. 1. Josephus, Antiquities, Book 2. 2. The Christ Conspiracy. 4. Alexander of Macedon. 6. Alexander the Great. 13. Ezekiel. 331 BC, 3564 AM. Alexander took in his train a large body of scientists and scholars attending the invasions of Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine and Egypt in their official capacity. Also architects, geographers, botanists, astronomers, mathematicians and zoologists. They would bring back to the Western world a wealth of knowledge on the East. It would be 2130 years before an operation in pursuit of knowledge was again conducted by a military expedition, in 1798 AD by the French under Napoleon Bonaparte. Entire volumes have been written showing the similarities between Alexander and Napoleon. Alexander visits the northern delta region of Egypt and envisions a great city that he planned to have built there, Alexandria. The city and port is designed by the architect Dinocrates of Rhodes. Alexandria would rival Tyre in Mediterranean commerce. In Egypt, Alexander visited the oracle of Ammon and began assuming the characteristics of this deity, the two-horned. Even in the scriptures in the book of Daniel, the king of the West would be a two-horned goat that would subdue a two-horned ram, Medo-Persian Empire. Alexander orders the rebuilding of the Egyptian temples of Karnak and Luxor and then leaves Egypt. This is 1080 years after the Luxor complex was finished in 1411 BC. Alexander then marched toward Babylon by way of Tyre and was met with an immense Persian army under Darius III, near the ruins of Nineveh at Arbela. On September 2021, a near-total eclipse of the sun is witnessed by the Macedonians and the Persians. This may indeed have been a normal eclipse by the moon. However, it must be noted that at this exact time of the year, planet Nibiru entered the inner solar system and passed between the Earth and Sun, perhaps not in transit. After 732 years outside the inner system below the ecliptic. If this sun darkening was not the moon, then what was witnessed was Nibiru passing in front of the sun. The astronomical calendrics denote the import of this year. This was 2484 years, 414 times 6 of the Phoenix chronology, another planet known to darken the sun. Alexander's invasion was not truly pan-Hellenic, a strictly Grecian conquest of the East. Athens and the other Greek governments despised the Macedonian supremacy, and this is reflected in the following numbers. This was a Macedonian invasion, Greece claiming the victory ex post facto. Out of the 43,000 troops under Alexander, Grecian states contributed only 7,000 soldiers. Of 61,000 cavalry, the Greeks contributed 600. Of a navy of 161 ships aiding Alexander by sea, only 20 of those vessels were Athenian warships out of the 300 warships Athens retained. Additionally, Darius III had in his army 50,000 Ionian Greeks that initially fought against Alexander. Not merely was this a Macedonian conquest, but it was the 476th year from the founding of Macedon in 807 BC. This number relates directly to both Israelite and Greek peoples, as we have already seen and will see continually. Darius III of Persia meets Alexander of Macedon in the Battle of Gaugamela with 34,000 cavalry against Alexander's 7,250 horsemen. After getting slaughtered the last two times, Darius gave up on his foot soldiers and relied heavily on his cavalry. The powerful Macedonian phalanx was unlike anything any ancient military had encountered. Alexander was severely outnumbered, pitted against a multinational federation under Persian control. The Persians ruled over millions of people. This immense host arrayed against Macedonians was to end the contest over Asia. The Macedonians prevailed, and the Greek losses were minimal compared to the 53,000 Persian casualties. Again, King Darius III fled, and Alexander then marched on to Babylon, where he was welcomed as a deliverer by the ruling priesthood. For a month, the women of Babylon openly prostituted themselves to the Greeks in a 30-day period of revelry. Sitting on the throne of Babylon, emissaries from all over the world visited the court of Alexander as he sat in the famous hall of Nebuchadnezzar II. Dignitaries from as far as Ethiopia, Libya, Carthage, Iberians from Spain at the edge of the world, Romans and even other Greeks crowned him. Among the visitors were Celts and Scythians from the north, already renowned as mighty warriors who were beginning to appear in the garrisons of several kingdoms as highly sought-out mercenaries. The events of this year are calendarically attached to important year dates in Israelite history. While this would mean nothing to the ordinary historian looking over this history of Persia and Macedon, to those who trace the migrations and deportations of the Israelites into Persia, Media, northern India, back into Palestine, into Egypt, throughout Asia Minor, the Aegean's thousands of islands, Greece and Macedon, these numbers would make more sense. This was 1080 years after the Israelites conquered the giant kingdoms of Bashan and Argob, northern Israel and Syria, in 1411 BC. This was 600 years after Israel and Judah in civil war became two kingdoms in 931 BC, and 414 years, cursed earth period, after 745 BC, when the 10 tribes of Israel were deported into Mesopotamia by the Assyrians and spread into Persia, Media and Scythia. This was 276 years, 138 times 2, after Babylon conquered Egypt in 607 BC, and 148 years, 1776 months, after the Greeks defeated the Persians at Plataea in 479 BC. The Israelites figure prominently in this year's calendrics because many thousands of those in the armies of King Darius III were of Israelite descent, just as Macedon was founded by people descended from former Israelites. Alexander departed Babylon toward the end of the year and marched his forces toward the capital city of Persia called Persepolis. On his way there, his own host was overtaken by reinforcements from Macedon, 1,500 cavalry and 13,500 soldiers. In this year, Sidon's old mint made coins portraying Alexander as Hercules or Melkart, the Phoenician deity, or guardian of the city. Interestingly, this was the 144th year from the founding of the Sidonian Mint, founded in 475 BC. 1. Alexander of Macedon.